There is a single frame in the original cartoon tucked away inside the Southern Air Temple that I have never quite been able to shake. It is a skeleton sitting where a gentle old monk used to be, ringed by the scorched armor of the Fire Nation soldiers he took down with him. The show does not linger on it, it gives you the aftermath and lets your own imagination do the cruel part. Netflix made a very different choice. It pulled the camera back 100 years and let you watch the whole thing happen: the festival, the fire, the last stand, the fall. And that one decision, whether to show you the war directly or only its long shadow, is the seed of nearly every change between the two versions of this story. Tonight we are going through all of it, slowly and carefully, from that first act of violence all the way to the siege at the north. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and if you haven't subscribed yet, it truly does help us keep making these. So let me start where both versions start, with the end of a world, because the way each one handles that ending tells you almost everything about the way each one thinks. In the original animated series, which ran on Nickelodeon from early 2005 to the summer of 2008, the genocide of the Air Nomads is treated as a wound the show keeps its hand pressed over. You do not see it happen, you feel it. The very first episode gives you a boy frozen in a glacier and two Water Tribe siblings who crack him free, and it is only later, when Aang finally flies home to the Southern Air Temple, expecting to find the family he left, that the true weight arrives. He walks through halls that should be full of laughing monks and children and finds them empty. He finds an old friend's home cold. And then he finds the skeleton I mentioned, the remains of Monk Gyatso, the man who raised him, surrounded by the fallen soldiers who came to kill him. The cartoon shows you a boy realizing in real time that everyone he ever loved has been dead for a century. It is one of the most devastating scenes in a program that was, on paper, made for children. And it lands precisely because the show trusts you to fill in the horror yourself. It refuses to dramatize the slaughter. It gives you the silence afterward. Netflix took the opposite road, and I understand exactly why, even as I miss the restraint. The live-action series opens 100 years in the past, before the freeze, and it stages the genocide as a set piece you actually witness. There is a gathering of airbenders, a festival that draws monks and nuns from across the temples into one place, and it is there, when they are together and unguarded, that the Fire Nation strikes, riding the terrible power of a passing comet. You see the temples burn, you see the pacifists, people whose entire discipline is built around evasion and defense rather than attack, cut down where they stand. The remake wants you to have no distance from the war at all. It wants the cost on the table from the first minutes, so that everything Aang carries afterward has a face you have already seen. Now here is the part I want to be careful about, because it is easy to get wrong and people have gotten it wrong. Watching the Netflix version, it can feel as though Aang lived through this, as though he stood in the fire. He did not. In the canon of both shows, Aang had already fled the Southern Air Temple and been frozen inside the iceberg, locked in the Avatar state, before the comet-powered attack ever came. He does not witness the genocide. He learns about it 100 years later, the way we learn about anything we were absent for, as a fact about a world that moved on without him. So when the live-action dramatizes the attack, understand what it is doing. It is showing the audience something the character never saw. It is a scene for us, not a memory for him. The remake lets you carry a knowledge that Aang has to discover slowly and alone, and that gap between what we know and what he is still finding out becomes one of the quiet engines of his grief. Which brings me to Gyatso, and to the difference that I think matters most in this opening. In both versions, the old monk dies, so I do not want to oversell this as some reversal. He is gone in the cartoon, and he is gone in the remake. But how you meet his death could not be more different. The animated series, as I said, gives you only the aftermath. The skeleton in the meditation pavilion, the ring of enemy armor around him telling you without a single word that this gentle man fought and fought hard at the very end. Netflix, refusing to leave anything to inference, actually stages his last stand. You watch Gyatso hold the line, watch him fight, watch him fall to Sozin's forces. And I will be honest about my own reaction here, because this is a channel built on honest reactions rather than a list of trivia. I think both work, and I think they work for opposite reasons. The cartoon's version is more haunting because your mind builds the scene, and the mind is always crueler and more precise than any animator. The remake's version is more immediate because you are denied the comfort of looking away. One trusts your imagination. The other refuses to let you off the hook. That tension between trusting you and refusing to trust you is going to come up again and again tonight, so hold on to it. There is also a smaller change threaded through this opening that is easy to miss, and it has to do with when everyone learns that Aang is the Avatar. In the original telling, the fact of Aang being the Avatar is established as part of the deeper backstory, revealed to him young and handled in a particular way by the monks who raised him, with all the pressure and isolation that identity brought crashing down on a 12-year-old too early. The live action reworks the timing, pushing the revelation closer to the eve of the attack so that the discovery of who Aang is and the destruction of everything he knows sit almost on top of each other. Read one way, the remake is compressing two of the weightiest beats of Aang's life into a single, unbearable stretch of time, which is efficient and also, I think, a little bit brutal because it robs the character of the years of ordinary boyhood the cartoon subtly let him have before the weight came down. And that is really the thesis of this whole opening, the thing everything else grows out of. The animated series believes that the strongest way to show you a war is to show you the hole it leaves, an empty temple, a cold room, a single skeleton, and the story you tell yourself about how bravely he must have died. The Netflix series believes just as sincerely that a modern audience needs the war made literal, needs to see the fire and the falling and the last stand, or the horror will not register at all. Neither belief is wrong exactly. They are just two completely different philosophies of storytelling wearing the same costume, and once you notice which one you are watching, you cannot stop noticing it. Every change we talk about tonight, from the way Zuko speaks to the way a spirit dies at the north, comes back to this. Does the story trust you to feel the thing it did not show, or does it insist on showing you so there is no way to feel anything else? That is the gap. Everything else is detail. Now follow that boy out of the temple, because the very next question the story has to answer is how he ended up in the ice. And here the two versions disagree in a way that softly rewrites who Aang is. In the original cartoon, Aang runs away. That is the plain and slightly uncomfortable truth of it. He is a child who has just learned he is the Avatar, and the monks, worried that his bond with Gyatso is holding back his training, decide to send him to another temple to be raised more strictly, away from the one person who loves him like a father. Aang overhears this. He is frightened and hurt and utterly overwhelmed. And so, one night, he takes Appa and he flees. He does not fly off to save the world. He flies off to escape it. And then a storm catches him over the open ocean, the water drags him and his bison down, and in the instant before he drowns, the Avatar state ignites on its own to save his life, freezing him and Appa inside a shell of ice for 100 years. That is the version most of us grew up with, and it is important that you sit with how heavy it is. Aang's absence from the world, the entire century of war that unfolds while the Fire Nation runs unchecked, begins with a scared kid making a scared choice. He ran, and when he wakes up 100 years later to find that everyone is dead and the world has burned, part of what he is carrying is the knowledge that he was not there, that he chose not to be there, even if the choice was the choice of a terrified child who could not have known. The Netflix series softens this almost completely. In the live action, Aang does not overhear a plan to take him from Gyatso, and he does not run away in fear and rebellion. He simply takes Appa out into the night to clear his head, to get some air and some distance from a pressure he does not yet understand. And it is on that ordinary flight that the storm finds him. He is swept into the water. The Avatar state freezes him. The outcome is identical, 100 years in the ice, but the moral shape of it is entirely rewritten. Netflix Aang is a boy things happen to. Cartoon Aang is a boy who did a thing. And the difference between those two is the difference between an accident and a decision. I have gone back and forth on this one more than almost any other change, so let me just tell you where I have landed. I think the remake made Aang more likable and less interesting in the same stroke. There is an obvious appeal to the softer version. Nobody wants to blame a grieving child for the ruin of the world, and the live action clearly did not want its hero, its Aang, to open the story with an act of abandonment hanging over him. It wanted him sympathetic from the first frame. But the guilt the cartoon handed him was not a flaw to be cleaned up. It was the whole spine of his character. The reason cartoon Aang spends 3 seasons so desperate to protect everyone, so unwilling to give up on anyone, so allergic to killing even the man who has earned death 100 times over, is that underneath all of it is a boy who ran once and swore, without ever saying it out loud, that he would never run again. Take away the running and you take away the thing he is running from. You are left with a lovely, gentle protagonist who happens to have been unlucky with the weather. The show implies in its original form that responsibility and guilt are not the same thing. and that a good person can carry a guilt they did not really earn and be shaped, even ennobled, by carrying it. Aang was a child. The genocide was not his fault, and no version of the story pretends it was. But he still feels that if he had been there, if he had not run, if he had been the avatar the world needed, instead of the frightened boy who fled, something might have been different. That feeling is irrational, and it is also completely human, and the cartoon lets him hold it because it knows that the good ones always do hold it. The remake, by making his disappearance a pure accident, quietly tells you that he has nothing to feel guilty about, which is kinder, and I think thinner. It resolves a tension the original was content to leave aching. There is a practical ripple to this change too, one that only becomes clear much later. When cartoon Aang finally faces down the temptation to abandon his friends and his duty again, when the story tests whether he will run one more time, that test means something because we watched him fail it at the very start. The remake, having removed the original failure, has to find other ways to give Aang an interior struggle. And it does reach for them, mostly by reframing his fear around his own power rather than around his own past choices. We will get to that because the live action does something really bold with Aang's central fear, and it is one of the more defensible reinventions in the whole adaptation. But it is worth noticing here that the moment you pull one thread, the whole garment shifts. Change why he ended up in the ice, and you have changed what he is afraid of, what he is atoning for, and what victory would even mean for him. I also want to name the thing underneath the thing, because it is a pattern you will see the Netflix writers repeat. Faced with a young hero whose origin includes a genuine moral failing, the modern adaptation tends to smooth the failing away and replace it with victimhood. Cartoon Aang chose wrongly and was punished by a century of ice. Netflix Aang chose nothing and was simply a victim of the storm and the war. This is not a small aesthetic tweak. It reflects a real and current difference in how stories think about their protagonists, a nervousness about letting the person we are meant to root for begin in a place of real fault. The cartoon, made 20 years ago for children, was somehow braver about this than the prestige adaptation made for adults. It let its 12-year-old messiah be, at the start, a coward, on the reasoning that what moves us most in any story is a coward becoming brave. The remake did not quite trust its audience to love a hero who started there. And here's what gets me about it. The small irony I keep circling. The live action bent over backwards to make its version of these events darker and more mature. It showed the fire, it showed Gyatso fall, it drenched the opening in a seriousness the cartoon only gestured at. And yet, on the one genuinely adult question available to it, whether its hero bears any responsibility for his own absence, it flinched and chose the gentler, more childlike answer. It is willing to show you a genocide, but not willing to let its protagonist have run away from home. The cartoon, so often dismissed as the kids' version, is the one that looked that particular darkness in the eye. That reversal, the supposedly grown-up adaptation being more protective of its hero than the show for children ever was, is one of the more revealing things about the whole enterprise. And we are only 2 changes in. Let me stay with the people who found him in the ice, because the 2 young siblings who crack Aang out of that glacier are handled very differently by the 2 shows. And the first big change lands on Sokka. If you grew up on the cartoon, you know exactly who Sokka is at the start. He is a teenage boy left in charge of a village with no other warriors in it, doing his clumsy best to be a man before he has any idea what that means. And one of the ways the original show expresses his immaturity is that he begins the story openly, cluelessly sexist. He tells Katara that girls are better suited to sewing and cooking than to fighting. He underestimates the women around him at nearly every turn. And the whole point of it, the reason the writers put it there, is that he is spectacularly, publicly wrong. And the story makes him pay for it. When Team Avatar reaches Kyoshi Island and Sokka runs headlong into the Kyoshi warriors, an elite unit of women who wipe the floor with him without breaking a sweat, his worldview gets dismantled in front of him and he has to swallow his pride, put on their uniform, and learn from them. That humbling is one of his first real steps toward the person he becomes, the sharp, loyal, self-aware strategist who ends up being the tactical backbone of the entire group. His sexism was never presented as acceptable. It was the flaw he was written to outgrow. The Netflix series removes it, almost entirely. The overt misogyny is gone, softened into something much milder, a sort of older brother bossiness, a leader and follower friction between him and Katara that has nothing to do with her being a girl. Both actors have spoken about this in interviews, framing it as a deliberate update, a decision that the casual sexism of the original did not need to be carried into a modern retelling. And on the face of it, I understand the instinct. Nobody was clamoring for more scenes of a teenage boy being dismissive of women. If you describe the change in a single sentence, it sounds like an obvious improvement, the removal of an ugly trait from a character we love. But here's where I have to push back a little, because I think this is one of the clearest cases in the whole adaptation of a change that sounds good in a press release and silently costs the story something real. A flaw that a character overcomes is not the same as a flaw the character simply has. Sokka's sexism in the cartoon was a piece of narrative machinery. It existed to be broken. It gave him somewhere to travel, a starting point low enough that his growth into a deeply respectful, fully competent young man actually meant something. When you delete the starting point, you do not just remove an unpleasant trait. You remove the journey attached to it. Netflix Sokka is more likable in his first episode and less transformed by his last because there was less to transform. The remake hands you the finished sculpture and skips the part where it was carved. And the change does not stay contained, which is the part that really interests me. The original series built an entire thematic thread out of gender and who is allowed to fight. Sokka's early sexism at the South rhymes deliberately with the sexism Katara runs into much later at the Northern Water Tribe, where the masters there refuse to teach women to fight at all, only to heal. The show sets up a boy who thinks girls should not fight, lets the world correct him, and then sends the group to a place where that same prejudice is baked into law and tradition, so that when Katara has to battle Master Pakku for the simple right to be taught, we already understand the shape of what she is fighting. It is one continuous argument the cartoon makes across a whole season. Netflix keeps the Northern Tribe sexism and stages its own version of the Katara and Pakku clash, but the fight lands very differently there. The old necklace recognition that used to melt his resolve is gone, and it has already sanded away the setup at the South, so the thread arrives with its first knot untied. The prejudice at the North now stands more or less alone, a problem that appears out of nowhere in the finale rather than the payoff of a pattern the show has been tracing since the first episode. You can still enjoy it, but it is load-bearing masonry that has faintly lost half its foundation. I want to be fair, because there is a real argument on the other side, and it is not just corporate caution. You can reasonably say that watching a beloved character be a jerk about women, even briefly, even with the show clearly disapproving, is a cost, and that a modern adaptation is allowed to decide the cost is not worth the payoff, especially when it can find growth for Sokka in other places. And the live action does try to give him other things to grow through. It leans much harder, for instance, into a strained relationship between Sokka and his father, Hakoda, and into Sokka's anxiety about whether he can lead, whether he measures up, whether he was right to stay behind and protect the village while the men went off to war. Those are real veins to mine, and the remake mines them. So it is not as though Netflix Sokka has no arc. It is that his arc has been swapped out for a quieter, more internal one, trading a visible flaw he conquers for a private insecurity he manages. But if I'm telling you where I actually land, it is this. The cartoon understood something a little unfashionable, which is that the deepest character growth requires a properly unflattering beginning, and that protecting a character from ever having been wrong is a way of protecting them from ever really changing. I would rather watch a boy who was foolish become wise than watch a boy who was basically fine become slightly more mature. The first is a story, the second is a character staying roughly where he started with better lighting. And the strange thing is that this is the same pattern we just saw with Aang. Give the hero a real fault at the start, or protect the hero from ever having one. The cartoon over and over chose the fault. The remake over and over chose the protection. Two shows, one instinct each, and you can feel that single instinct playing out across every character it touches. There is one more casualty in the neighborhood of this change worth naming, because it is small and I still felt it. In the original, a great deal of Sokka's charm comes from the gap between how seriously he takes himself and how absurd he often is, the meat and sarcasm and boomerang of it all. And that comedy is partly fueled by the fact that he is so often wrong. A character who is wrong in a funny way and knows it later is a comedy engine. Smooth out the wrongness and you also, a little, smooth out the comedy, which is one small reason the live-action Sokka, for all that the performance is charming, can feel a touch flatter, a touch more like a normal, capable young man, and a touch less like the ridiculous, lovable disaster the cartoon adored. It is a fair trade the remake made on purpose. It is just like almost everything tonight, a trade, and I do not think it came for free. Katara gets a different kind of rewrite, and it is one of the changes I find sincerely thoughtful, even where I am not sure it works. Book 1 is called Water, and in the cartoon that title carries a double meaning, because the season is about two people learning to bend it. Katara has a natural affinity for waterbending, but almost no training, since the war stripped the southern water tribe of its benders and left her the last one, self-taught and largely alone in her gift. Aang, as the Avatar, has to learn all 4 elements in turn, and water is next in his cycle. So the show pairs them. They find a waterbending scroll, they practice together, they stumble through the forms side by side, one a prodigy with no teacher, and the other a natural learner with every advantage, and the friendly friction between them. The way she is better at this one thing than the boy who is supposed to be better at everything becomes a lovely little engine of their bond. By the end of the season, they have both grown as benders, and Aang can hold his own in water even as Katara begins to outstrip him. Netflix pulls the two of them apart. In the live action, waterbending is Katara's domain and Katara's alone. Aang never waterbends in Season 1. Let me say that again because it is a truly strange fact about a season subtitled Water. The Avatar, the one person alive who is meant to master all 4 elements, does not bend a single drop of water across the entire first season of the show named for it. The remake makes a deliberate choice to keep his elemental journey slower and more spread out, to not rush him into a second element in the very first stretch, and instead it hands the whole waterbending story to Katara, who now struggles with it privately, working at the forms on her own, wrestling with a discipline that does not come easily, growing from a girl who can barely move a puddle into someone who can hold a line at the north. There is a real case for this, and I want to give it its full weight before I complain. Making waterbending hard for Katara rather than something she has an easy natural gift for, arguably respects the discipline more. It turns her mastery into an achievement rather than a birthright. And keeping Aang out of the water for now means that when he finally does begin to move through the elements, it will feel earned and paced rather than checked off a list. The live action clearly wants each element to be a season's worth of work, not a subplot resolved in a few episodes, and given that it got the green light for all 3 seasons fairly early, spreading the elemental arc out is a defensible long game. Katara, as the sole waterbender of the story, also makes her the emotional and practical center of the group, in a way the cartoon shared out more evenly. She is not learning alongside the Avatar. She is the one carrying the water, full stop. But something is lost, and it is the thing that made cartoon Katara sing. In the original, her waterbending is bound up with her fire, her temper, her fierce, and sometimes reckless conviction. She is not a careful, struggling student. She is a force who happens to lack training, and a lot of her early trouble comes not from being unable to do the moves, but from wanting to do them too much, too fast, too proudly. The famous beat where she and Aang acquire that waterbending scroll turns on Katara's flaw, her competitiveness, her refusal to let Aang be better than her at the one thing that is hers, even her willingness to bend the rules to get her hands on it. She is allowed to be difficult. She's allowed to want. The remake's Katara, recast as the quiet, solitary striver working patiently at a hard craft, is more admirable, and if I am honest, a little less alive. The original gave her a temper the show had to keep reckoning with. The adaptation gave her a work ethic. I miss the temper. The scroll itself is a good tiny example of how these changes chain together. In the cartoon, that waterbending scroll is stolen. Team Avatar crosses paths with a band of pirates, and the scroll is pirate loot, and getting it involves a whole caper of theft and double-cross and Katara's guilty conscience. An entire episode's worth of adventure and character revelation built around a single object. Netflix, having compressed the season hard and dropped the pirates almost entirely, needed the scroll to come from somewhere else, and so it makes it a family heirloom, something passed down through the lineage of Gran, whose name is Kana, the grandmother of Katara and Sokka. Instead of a trophy pried from thieves, it is an inheritance, a piece of the Water Tribe's own lost knowledge handed quietly from grandmother to granddaughter. And read one way, that is rather beautiful, because it ties Katara's bending to her blood and her family and the culture the war tried to erase, rather than to a random encounter with pirates. Read another way, it is the story losing an entire adventure, a whole episode of texture and mischief and moral trouble, folded down into a single meaningful prop. That is the trade the compression keeps forcing. A sprawling, messy, delightful detour becomes a clean, resonant object, and you gain elegance and lose the sprawl that made the world feel large. The family thread reaches further than the scroll, though, and here is where a change I mentioned earlier comes back around. In the cartoon, one of the deepest wounds in these two siblings is their father. Hakoda left the South to fight in the war, sailing off with the other men when his children were young, and the show puts a great deal of the ache about that departure onto Katara. She is the one who lost her mother to a Fire Nation raid, and then, in a sense, lost her father to the war. And the anger and longing about being left behind lives strongly in her. Netflix shifts the center of that wound onto Sokka. The live action leans into Sokka's tension with Hakoda, his fear that he did not measure up, his complicated feelings about being the boy left home to guard the village while his father went to be a warrior. It is part of the same rebalancing we have been tracing. The remake handing Sokka a private, internal struggle to replace the external flaw it took away from him. And it does give the live-action Sokka real material, but it also subtly takes something from Katara. In the original, her relationship to her absent father and her murdered mother is one of the great emotional spines of her character, the source of both her tenderness and her rage. Move the father wound over to Sokka, and Katara is left holding a little less of her own history. So Book 1, Water, in the remake, becomes a season about one girl teaching herself a hard art in near solitude, which is a perfectly good story and not quite the story the title was originally pointing at. The cartoon's Water was about partnership, two kids learning together, one gifted and untrained, one destined and behind, sharpening each other. The live-action's Water is about a lone striver, and I keep coming back to the fact that Aang, the Avatar, the whole reason the water matters, sits the season out where bending is concerned. It is the boldest structural bet in the first season, this refusal to rush him, and it is the one I'm least sure about because it means the person the show is named for spends the first eighth of his own story, on the elemental front at least, largely as a passenger. Whether that patience pays off is a question only the later seasons can answer, and having seen where the second season goes, I will just say the jury is still out. But you can already feel the shape of the wager. The cartoon spent its water fast and freely. The remake is hoarding it, saving Aang's elements like a slow-burning fuse, and betting that the wait will be worth it. Now let me turn to the Fire Nation, because this is where the two shows structurally diverge the most, and it is worth understanding before we get to any single character. In the cartoon, the Fire Nation reveals itself slowly, like a hand of cards played one at a time across 3 seasons. In Book 1, the face of the enemy is essentially 2 men. There is Prince Zuko, the scarred, banished young prince chasing the Avatar in a desperate bid to win back his father's love, and there is Commander Zhao, the ambitious naval officer who becomes Zuko's rival for the prize. That is nearly the whole of it. The Fire Lord himself, Ozai, is kept almost entirely in shadow through the first season, a voice, a silhouette, a throne wreathed in flame, a presence felt far more than seen. And the truly terrifying members of the royal family are still being held in reserve. Mai and Ty Lee are nowhere to be found in Book 1, and even Azula only flickers past once, an unnamed face watching from the shadows of a flashback, long before anyone knew to be afraid of her. They arrive at the start of Book 2, and their entrance is one of the great gear shifts of the series. The moment the show stops being a road trip with a bumbling prince on your tail and becomes something with a genuine predator in it. The cartoon withholds Azula on purpose. It lets you get comfortable with Zuko as the villain, lets you even start to sympathize with him, and then it drops his little sister into the story, a prodigy so cold and so gifted that Zuko himself is terrified of her. And the whole temperature of the show drops 10 degrees. Netflix throws almost all of that onto the table in Season 1. Ozai is fully visible from early on, seated at court, speaking, scheming, a flesh and blood tyrant rather than a shadow. Azula is present through much of the season, not as a surprise, but as an active player, scheming at court, manipulating Zhao, undermining her brother from a distance, working her father's will. And both Mai and Ty Lee appear in the first season as well, introduced around the trip to Omashu, positioned alongside Azula at the Fire Nation court. Every one of these characters in the original is a Book 2 arrival. The remake pulls the entire royal ensemble forward by a whole season. I have complicated feelings about this, so let me lay them out honestly rather than pretend to a clean verdict. The cost is obvious and I think real. Azula's power in the cartoon comes substantially from her delayed entrance. She is a shark you do not see until the water's already red. By putting her on screen from the beginning, Netflix trades that dread for a different kind of tension, the slow burn court intrigue of a princess, undermining her exiled brother from home while he chases a boy across the sea. You lose the ambush, you lose that magnificent, stomach-dropping moment where the show reveals it had a far worse villain in its back pocket the whole time. And a first-time viewer of the remake will simply never experience the particular fear the cartoon engineered, the fear of Azula precisely because you did not know she was coming. But I do not think the change is stupid, and here is why. The cartoon could afford to hold its villains back because it had 61 episodes to spend, and an episodic structure that let it wander for a whole season before tightening the screws. Netflix has 8 episodes a season and a serialized structure that demands a clear engine of conflict running from the first hour. If Ozai stays a shadow and Azula stays off stage, the live-action Season 1 has only Zuko and Zhao to carry the Fire Nation's menace, and that is a thin bench for a show that wants you to feel the weight of an empire. So the remake reaches into Book 2, pulls the royals forward, and uses them to give the Fire Nation a court, a politics, a home front, a sense that behind Zuko's little ship there is a whole poisonous family and a whole poisonous throne. It is a legitimate structural solution to a real structural problem. It just pays for it with one of the cartoon's best surprises. Azula specifically gets a fascinating small addition, and this is one I actually admire. In the cartoon, Azula's signature is blue fire, hotter and more controlled than the ordinary orange flame, a visual shorthand for the fact that she is simply a level above almost everyone else, a prodigy from birth. The show presents it as a given. She is the genius. Her fire is blue because she is Azula. Netflix, instead of presenting the blue flames as a fact, dramatizes her earning them. It shows her developing the blue fire through rage, her power intensifying in the heat of sparring and fury, the color deepening as her control and her anger sharpen together. And I find that really clever because it turns a piece of visual iconography into a piece of character. In the remake, the blue flame is not just proof that Azula is talented, it is proof that Azula's talent is bound up with her rage, that her power grows as her feelings darken, which softly sets up the psychological unraveling that, in the cartoon, becomes the tragic center of her arc much later. Reading it that way, the live action is planting a seed in Season 1 for something the original did not fully articulate until near its end, the idea that Azula's fire and Azula's fracture are the same thing. There is a risk in all this forward loading that I would be dishonest not to name, and it is the risk of spending your best material too early. The cartoon's slow reveal was not just about surprise, it was about pacing a 3-season escalation, making sure that each new tier of villain arrived exactly when the heroes were ready to face a harder challenge. By bringing Azula, Ozai, Mai, and Ty Lee all forward into the first season, the remake risks flattening that escalation, risks having shown you the whole royal family before it has fully earned them, risks leaving itself less room to climb. When your scariest villain is already on screen in the first hour, where do you go? The cartoon always had somewhere worse to take you. The remake has front-loaded a great deal of its menace, and it will need to find new heights in its later seasons rather than simply unveiling villains it kept in reserve because it has very few left in reserve. Still, if I am being fair, there is a real pleasure to the Fire Nation court that the remake gives itself room for. A sense of the enemy as a functioning, treacherous family rather than a series of individual antagonists the heroes bump into on the road. The cartoon's Fire Nation in Book 1 is mostly something chasing you. The remake's Fire Nation from the start is a place with a throne and a politics and a set of siblings circling each other, and that added texture is not nothing. It is the same trade we keep finding. The cartoon gains suspense by withholding. The remake gains density by revealing. And which one you prefer probably says as much about you as it does about either show, whether you would rather be surprised or whether you would rather be shown the whole board and made to watch the pieces move. Zhao changes too, and though it is a smaller adjustment than the whole royal family arriving early, it fits the same pattern, so let me dwell on it for a moment before we get to Zuko. The cartoon's Zhao is a bully in a good uniform. He is a domineering, arrogant naval officer, a man who outranks Zuko and never lets him forget it. And his ambition, while real, is fairly straightforward. He wants glory, he wants the Avatar, he wants to rise, and he pursues those things by throwing his weight around and leaning on the authority he already has. He is dangerous because he is powerful and cruel, not because he is especially cunning. His scheming, when he schemes, is the scheming of a man who is used to getting his way by force. Netflix reworks him into something slyer. The live-action Zhao is an ambitious climber in the fullest sense, a manipulator, a man reading the room and playing the angles, openly gunning for power and willing to be flattering, deceptive, and patient to get it. And crucially, the remake pairs him with Azula. In the cartoon, Zhao and Azula never really share a stage because she is not in Book 1 at all. In the live action, Azula works Zhao from the Fire Nation court, feeding his ambition, using him as an instrument against her own brother, so that Zhao's rise is not just the story of one greedy officer, but part of the princess's larger game. He becomes a piece on Azula's board, which makes him at once more interesting and more disposable, a man who thinks he is climbing under his own power while a teenager back home moves him around like furniture. This is a smart bit of connective tissue, and I will give the remake credit for it, because it solves one of the real problems that comes from pulling Azula forward. If you're going to put Azula in Season 1 with nothing yet to do against Team Avatar directly, you need to give her something to scheme about, and turning Zhao into her cat's paw does exactly that. It braids two Fire Nation threads that ran separately in the cartoon into a single rope. Zhao gets a puppet master, Azula gets a project, and the court intrigue the remake wants gets an engine. On paper, it is exactly the kind of clever restructuring an adaptation should do. What it costs, though, is a certain clean simplicity. The cartoon's Zhao is memorable, partly because he is so uncomplicated a monster, a big, loud obstacle who exists to be an obstacle, a man whose overreach is the whole of his character and eventually the cause of his downfall. The remake's Zhao is craftier and more entangled, and in becoming craftier, he becomes a little less iconic, a little more like one more scheming courtier in a show that now has several. There is something to be said for a villain who is exactly what he appears to be. The live-action's Zhao is exactly what he appears to be only until you notice the strings, and once you notice them, he stops being quite so much his own man. The reason I linger on Zhao at all, though, is that he is the perfect bridge to the character the entire Fire Nation half of this story really turns on. Because if you want to understand what the remake is trying to do with its villains, the clearest place to look is not Zhao or even Azula. It is the banished prince chasing a boy across the sea. The one character both shows agree is the beating heart of the whole thing. The one that even people who disliked the live action tended to admit it mostly got right. So let me spend real time on Zuko because the changes there are subtle, deliberate, and, in a couple of cases, honestly revealing about the different souls of these two shows. The first thing to understand about Zuko is that both shows love him, and it shows. Whatever else the live action got wrong for some viewers, the near universal agreement is that Zuko survived the translation, that Dallas Liu's performance caught the wounded pride and the buried decency, that this one character came through mostly intact. So the changes here are not the changes of a show that misunderstood him. They are the changes of a show that understood him and chose to shade him differently, and those are the more interesting kind. Let me start with the strangest one, because it is the kind of detail that sounds trivial and turns out to be a whole thesis. In the cartoon, Zuko is obsessed with a single word, honor. He says it constantly. His honor was taken from him. He must restore his honor. Capturing the Avatar will return his honor. Everything he does is in the name of his honor. It became so central that it curdled into a fond joke among fans, the prince who could not get through a scene without invoking the thing he had lost. Netflix, reportedly, cut the word almost entirely out of his Season 1 dialogue. His signature obsession, the term that defined him in 1,000 memes, is essentially absent from his mouth in the live action. Now, on the surface, that looks like the remake running scared of a meme, sanding off a beloved verbal tick because it had become a punchline. And maybe there is a little of that, but I think there is something more considered underneath, and it is worth sitting with. The word honor, repeated as often as the cartoon repeated it, does a specific thing. It externalizes Zuko's wound. It turns his entire inner life into a slogan, a single abstract noun he can point at, instead of feeling the actual grief and rejection and shame underneath. That was, in the cartoon, partly the point. Zuko clings to the word honor because it is easier than facing what really happened to him. That his father maimed him and cast him out and never loved him the way a father should. The remake, in stripping the word away, forces the wound to stay unspoken, forces you to read it in the performance and the behavior rather than hear it announced. Zuko no longer tells you he wants his honor back. He simply burns with a need he cannot name, and you have to watch him to understand it. Read generously, that is not the remake being embarrassed by the cartoon. That is the remake trusting silence over slogan, which, after everything I have said tonight about the two shows and their opposite instincts, is a fascinating reversal. The live-action choosing restraint, exactly where the cartoon chose repetition. Then there is the Agni Kai, the origin of Zuko's scar. And here, the change is not cosmetic at all. It reaches down and touches the meaning of the character. In the cartoon, the story of how Zuko got his scar is one of the more quietly horrifying things in the whole series. As a boy, Zuko speaks out of turn in his father's war room, disrespecting a general's plan that would sacrifice Fire Nation soldiers as bait. And for that breach of protocol, he is challenged to an Agni Kai, a fire duel. He assumes he will face the general. He turns and finds that his opponent is his own father. And the crucial thing, the thing that defines cartoon Zuko forever, is that he refuses to fight. He falls to his knees and begs. He will not raise his hands against his father. And Ozai, disgusted by what he sees as cowardice and weakness, burns his son across the face and banishes him. Zuko is scarred and exiled not for fighting, but for refusing to fight, for having, at 13, more decency and more love than his father could stand. That is the tragedy. He was punished for his goodness. Netflix changes the shape of the duel. In the live action, young Zuko does not simply kneel and refuse. He fights back. He engages, and for a moment he even gains the upper hand against his father, before Ozai overpowers and burns him. And young Azula, watching, does not wear the cold little smirk the cartoon gave her. She reacts with something closer to fear or awe, a flicker of genuine horror at what their father is capable of. I have thought about this one a lot, and I land in a divided place, so let me give you both halves. What the remake loses is precise, and it is painful to lose. The cartoon's version is a story about a boy destroyed for refusing violence, and that refusal is the seed of everything good in him. The reason we always sense, even when he is hunting Aang, that there is a gentler person trapped inside the angry one. When Netflix lets him fight back, it makes him more conventionally sympathetic in the modern sense, a kid who stood up for himself, who did not just take it. And it slightly blunts the specific, terrible irony that his goodness was the very thing that got him burned. What the remake gains is a different reading, one where Zuko's tragedy is not that he refused to fight, but that he could not win, that even his defiance was not enough, that he tried and was crushed anyway. And Azula's fear, instead of her smirk, does something I actually like. It complicates her early, suggesting that the monstrous princess was once a frightened little girl watching her father maim her brother, that whatever she became, she began as a child in that room too, terrified. The cartoon saved Azula's humanity for the very end. The remake sprinkles a little of it in from the start. I am not sure the trade is worth what it costs the original irony, but I understand why a modern show reached for it, and I cannot pretend it is empty. The best addition to Zuko, though, the one where I think the remake unambiguously enriches him, is the story of the 41st Division. In the cartoon, the reason for Zuko's banishment, the war room, the sacrifice of soldiers he objected to, is told to us but stays somewhat abstract. Netflix dramatizes it and then does something the cartoon never did. It establishes that the soldiers Zuko spoke up to save, the young recruits who would have been thrown away as bait, are the 41st Division, and that the crew of Zuko's own banishment ship are those very soldiers. The men serving under the exiled prince, the crew he lives among during his long, humiliating hunt, are the people he saved. They owe him their lives. And so the ship, which in the cartoon is mostly a lonely prison Zuko shares with his uncle, becomes in the remake a place of quiet, earned loyalty, a small community of men who follow this angry young prince, not because they must, but because he once stood up and bled for them. I love this change without reservation, and I will tell you exactly why. It takes Zuko's defining act of decency, the moment that got him scarred and exiled, and instead of letting it vanish into backstory, it makes that decency physically present in his everyday life. Every day on that ship, Zuko is surrounded by living proof that his goodness had a cost and also had a worth, that the thing his father punished him for actually saved lives. The banishment was a punishment, but hidden inside it is a reward the cartoon never spelled out. A crew of men who love him for the exact quality his father despised. It deepens him. It gives the loneliest stretch of his life a warmth the original left cold. And it does it without contradicting a single thing about who Zuko is. That is what a great adaptation change looks like. It does not replace the character. It finds something that was always implied in him and brings it into the light. There are smaller Zuko changes too, and I will name them quickly because they are the kind of texture that adds up. The live action gives Zuko a journal, a record he keeps of Avatar sightings, of the 100 years of history he is trying to piece together in his hunt, which is a nice, human touch. The obsessive prince literally writing his obsession down, turning his quest into a scholar's dossier. And the remake omits a beat the cartoon had, where Zuko takes Katara's betrothal necklace and uses it. A small act of casual cruelty and manipulation that the original leaned on to remind you he was, at that point, still the enemy. Netflix drops it, keeping its Zuko a shade less petty, a shade more sympathetic, in keeping with everything else we have seen it do, softening the rough edges of the people it wants us to love. It is the same instinct as removing Sokka's sexism and removing Aang's flight, applied to Zuko in miniature. And it is worth noticing that the one time the remake let a hero keep his defining fault, it was Zuko's rage, which it wisely understood it could not remove without removing him. Everywhere else it sanded. On Zuko, it mostly let the fire burn, and that restraint is a good part of why he came through. Riding on that same ship is the other half of Zuko's soul, and Iroh gets a change that is less about what happens to him than about when we learn who he is. In the cartoon, Uncle Iroh is, for a long time, comic relief with hidden depths. He is the tea-loving, joke-cracking, endlessly patient old man following his angry nephew around the world, and the show lets you underestimate him almost as thoroughly as its characters do. You know he is warm, you know he is wise in a rambling, proverbial way. But the full weight of his grief, the tragedy that made him the gentle man he is held back. It is not until Book 2, in one of the best-loved short pieces the series ever made, that the show reveals Iroh had a son, Luten, who died in the war, and that Iroh's whole soft philosophy, his refusal of ambition, his tenderness toward a nephew who is not his child, grew out of that loss. The moment where Iroh sits alone and sings a quiet little song for his dead boy is, for a lot of people, the single most affecting thing in the entire cartoon, and part of why it hits so hard is that it arrives after a season, and more of watching him be gentle without knowing what the gentleness cost. Netflix moves the grief forward. The live action weaves Luten and the tragedy of his death into Season 1, foregrounding Iroh's loss much earlier, letting it color his behavior from the start, folding it in around events like his capture and his time with Zuko rather than saving it for a later, quieter season. The song and the sun come early, and I want to hold both the gain and the loss of this in my hands at once because it is a close call. What the remake gains is immediate depth. From early on, you understand that this jolly old man is carrying a dead child, and that understanding recolors every warm thing he does. His patience with Zuko is not just temperament, it is a bereaved father pouring the love he cannot give his own son into the angry nephew in front of him. When you know about Luten from the beginning, Iroh's every gentleness becomes an act of grief transmuted into care, and that is a powerful thing to hand an audience in the first hours of a story. The live action wants you to feel the tragedy under the tea from the start, and it earns a real tenderness by doing so. What it loses is the ambush of tenderness, the thing the cartoon did so well. In the original, Luten's death is a revelation, a curtain pulled back on a man you thought you had figured out, and the delay is the whole engine of its power. You spend a season loving Iroh as a funny old uncle, and then the show silently tells you what he lost. And suddenly all that funniness reads as courage, the courage of a man choosing joy in spite of the worst grief there is. Move the reveal to the front, and it stops being a revelation. It becomes a premise. You never get to underestimate Iroh, which means you never get the gut punch of learning you were wrong to. This is the part that gets me about the whole pattern, honestly, and Iroh is where it comes clearest. The cartoon, again and again, builds its most powerful moments out of delay, out of letting you believe one thing and then, much later, showing you the deeper truth underneath so that the emotion detonates all at once. The disappearance that turns out to be a choice. The uncle who turns out to be a grieving father. The little sister you did not know was coming. The remake, again and again, front loads. It tells you the deep truth early, colors everything with it from the start, trades the detonation for a long, steady ache. Neither is wrong. A slow ache is a real and valid way to move an audience. But it is a fundamentally different emotional technology, and once you see that the two shows are running on opposite engines, delayed revelation versus early saturation, almost every timing change in the adaptation clicks into place. Iroh's grief is just the clearest single instance of it. I will say, of everything the remake moved earlier, Iroh's sorrow is the one I mind the least and maybe even faintly approve of. Zuko needs Iroh to be visibly, deeply good very quickly because in the compressed 8-episode structure, there is not time to slowly reveal the uncle's depths while also running everything else. And there is something to be said for letting the audience carry the knowledge of Lu Ten alongside Iroh from the beginning, so that his relationship with Zuko reads, from the first, as one wounded person trying to save another. It is a warmer, sadder version of the character from the outset. The cartoon made you earn Iroh's tragedy. The remake gives it to you freely, up front, and asks you to carry it the whole way through. I still think the cartoon's version hit harder, but I understand a show that decided the tragedy was too good to keep hidden, and that decided you deserved to know from the moment you met him exactly how much love this gentle old man was carrying and exactly what it had cost him. Let me leave the Fire Nation ship for a while and follow Aang somewhere stranger, into the spirit world, because the remake makes a set of changes there that are among the boldest and most debated in the whole first season. In the cartoon, the spirit world is a lonely place, and it is lonely on purpose. When Aang crosses over, he crosses over alone. It is part of the burden of being the Avatar, this ability to slip out of the physical world into the world of the spirits, and it is a burden precisely because no one can follow him there. His friends can guard his body, but they cannot go with him. The spiritual side of the Avatar's job is fundamentally solitary, a set of doors only he can walk through, and the cartoon uses that solitude to underline how singular and how isolating his role really is. There are things about being the Avatar that Katara and Sokka simply cannot share, and the spirit world is the clearest of them. Netflix opens the door and lets the others through. In the live action, when Aang crosses into the spirit world, Sokka and Katara get pulled in with him, and the three of them move through that eerie landscape together. And this connects directly to something the research and the fans both flagged, that in the remake, Aang is not alone at his lowest, most frightened moments the way the cartoon sometimes left him. His friends are with him, physically present in the spirit world itself, sharing the danger and the strangeness. On that journey, they cross paths with two of the series' great spirit characters, Wan Shu Tong, the enormous knowledge-hoarding owl spirit, and Ko, the face stealer, one of the more quietly terrifying figures the franchise ever created. And Aang, in that eerie place, gets a reunion the cartoon handled very differently. A meeting with the spirit of monk Gyatso, a chance to sit with the man he lost and begin to make peace with the grief we talked about at the very start of tonight. I have genuinely mixed feelings about bringing the companions into the spirit world, so let me argue both sides fairly. The loss is thematic. The Avatar's loneliness is one of the deep, sad truths of the whole mythology. The idea that this one person carries something no one else can carry, walks paths no one else can walk, and by letting Sokka and Katara tag along, the remake softens that isolation, makes the spiritual burden a group activity, dilutes the specific melancholy of a boy who must face the spirits by himself. Something about the Avatar being alone in the dark is important, and the live action gives a little of it away. But the gain is real too, and it is not only sentimental. Serialized television lives and dies on keeping its ensemble together and active. And one of the structural problems with adapting the cartoon's Spirit World episodes is that they tend to bench half the cast while Aang goes off alone. By pulling Sokka and Katara across, the remake keeps its trio functioning as a unit, keeps everyone with something to do, and turns a solitary spiritual trial into a shared ordeal that deepens the bonds between the three of them. And there is a genuine emotional logic to Aang not being alone when he confronts Gyatso, to having the people who love him beside him when he faces the worst of his grief. The cartoon's Aang bore the spirit world by himself because that was the point. The remake's Aang bears it with friends because a modern, serialized show wants its heart to be the group, not the lone chosen one. Different values, different choices. Then there is Kyoshi, and this is where the remake does something the cartoon flatly never did, something that sincerely made me sit up. In the live action, the past Avatar Kyoshi does not merely advise Aang or appear to him in a vision. She takes over his body and physically fights with it, manifesting through him to battle Fire Nation soldiers in the physical world, moving his limbs, wielding his power, a dead avatar wearing a living one like armor and going to war. The cartoon showed past avatars lending guidance, showed the avatar state channeling their collective power, but it never showed a specific past life seizing the current avatar's body to fight a physical battle the way the remake does here. It is a new mechanic, and it is a striking one. I think this is one of the more defensible inventions in the whole season, and I will tell you why it works for me even though it is not canonical to the cartoon. It solves a real problem the remake created for itself. Remember, Netflix decided that Aang would not learn waterbending in Season 1, decided to keep his power slow and spread out, which means its avatar is, for most of the first season, not able to do very much in a fight. That is a risky choice for a protagonist, so the show needs another way to occasionally let its avatar be truly powerful and really frightening, to remind you what he is, without simply handing him the mastery it has decided to withhold. Kyoshi possessing his body is that pressure valve. It lets the audience feel the terrifying scale of the avatar's inheritance, the thousands of lifetimes standing behind this one boy, without pretending the boy himself has learned to wield it yet. It is borrowed power, and the fact that it is borrowed, that a stern, ancient avatar has to reach through Aang to do what Aang cannot yet do himself, actually reinforces the season's whole thesis about him, that he is not ready, that the power is there but not yet his. That is clever adaptation, using a new mechanic to shore up an old theme. Ko, though, gives us the clearest example of the remake choosing to withhold where the cartoon revealed, which is a nice inversion of the pattern we have been tracking, so pay attention here. In the cartoon, Aang's encounter with Ko the Face Stealer is not just a scare, it is functional. It is where he learns something he needs, the identities and nature of the moon and ocean spirits, the knowledge that will matter enormously at the North. The terrifying spirit, for all his menace, is also, in a sense, an informant, and the scene does double duty, delivering dread and delivering plot. Netflix expands Ko's mythology, deepens him, ties him into the lore of the Mother of Faces, makes him grander and stranger, and then, notably, has him not hand over the crucial information about the moon and ocean spirits that his cartoon counterpart provided. The remake makes Ko scarier and less useful at the same time, keeping him as pure threat and finding the necessary information elsewhere. And I find that choice subtly telling because for once the remake is the one holding something back. Usually, as we have seen all night, it is the live action that shows and explains and front-loads while the cartoon withholds and delays. Here it flips. The cartoon used Ko to explain, the remake uses Ko to frighten, and lets the explanation come from another direction. It suggests that even a show as committed to showing you everything as this one has its instincts about when a monster is more powerful as a mystery than as a source of answers. Ko, expanded and darkened and stripped of his exposition, becomes more purely what he is, a thing that will take your face if you show it the wrong feeling, and there is something bracing about the remake trusting him to be scary without needing him to be helpful. It is a small thing, but in a season that so often chooses to say the quiet part out loud, Ko is a place where the live action, for once, chooses the dark. Since we are among the past avatars, let me stay there, because the remake reshuffles who guides Aang and, more importantly, what they tell him to do. And that reshuffling changes the entire shape of the season's quest. In the cartoon, the past avatar who matters in Book 1 is Roku. He is Aang's immediate predecessor, the previous incarnation, and he is written as a stern, wise, slightly sorrowful mentor, a grave old man who appears to give Aang the hard truths he needs. and the one crucial thing Roku gives him is a deadline. Roku warns Aang about Sozin's comet, the same comet that powered the genocide a century ago, and tells him it is returning, and that when it returns it will make the Fire Nation's firebenders nearly unstoppable. That warning sets the clock for the entire series. Aang has until the comet comes to master all 4 elements and defeat the Fire Lord. And that ticking clock, that 1-year deadline, is the engine that drives the whole cartoon forward. Every episode, however leisurely, sits under the shadow of that comet. There is a date, and the world ends if he is not ready by it. Netflix removes the comet deadline from season 1 entirely. And in its place, as the driving warning, it substitutes a different past avatar and a different prophecy. It is Kyoshi, the towering, fearsome, ancient avatar we already met possessing Aang's body, who delivers the season's central omen, and her warning is not about a comet at all. It is about the Water Tribe. Kyoshi warns Aang that a great doom is coming to the north, that the Northern Water Tribe faces catastrophe, and that becomes the quest that pulls the season toward its finale. Instead of racing a comet, Aang is racing toward a place, hurrying to the north to prevent a disaster he has been warned about, and the season's momentum comes from that prophecy rather than from a countdown. This is one of the most consequential structural changes in the whole adaptation, and I want to slow down on it because it explains a lot about why the 2 shows feel so different in the gut. The comet deadline is what makes the cartoon urgent even when it is wandering. You can spend an episode at a fortune teller's village or crossing a great canyon or larking about, and it never quite feels like time wasted because underneath the fun there is always that clock. The 1-year limit gives the cartoon's episodic road trip a spine of dread. Remove it, and the remake loses that particular tension, the sense of a countdown running under everything. In exchange, it gains a cleaner, more immediate goal: get to the north, stop the doom Kyoshi foretold, which is arguably better suited to a tight 8-episode serialized season that does not have time to feel the slow pressure of a distant deadline anyway. The cartoon's clock was a long game device, built for 61 episodes. The remake, with 8, reaches for a nearer, sharper target. I go back and forth on whether this was wise, and I will land somewhere honest rather than tidy. Losing the comet from season 1 does thin the stakes in a way I felt. The comet is such an elegant piece of design, a threat that is also a deadline that is also a thematic echo of the genocide, the same cosmic event that ended the Air Nomads now looming over the whole war. To set it aside for the first season is to leave one of the franchise's best ideas on the shelf. But I also understand that a serialized show cannot easily sustain a season-long countdown that it has no intention of resolving until years later. A clock that never runs out gets frustrating, so the remake pockets the comet for later, using Kyoshi's North Prophecy as a nearer engine, and flags the comet at the very end as a threat still to come. It is a reasonable bet, I just missed the ticking. Then there are the guides themselves, and here the remake makes a choice I have the least patience for, so let me be candid. Netflix introduces Avatar Kuruk early in season 1, complete with the dark, tragic backstory drawn from the young adult novels, his encounters with a malevolent spirit, the sorrow that shaped him. In the cartoon, Book 1 featured only Roku among the past avatars in any real way, and Kuruk did not figure at all in that early stretch. Bringing him forward is part of the remake's larger project of deepening the mythology early, pulling lore from across the wider franchise into the first season. And on its own, I do not mind it. More past avatars, more texture, more of the long chain of lives behind Aang, that is fine, even welcome. What I mind is what the remake does to Roku. The cartoon's Roku is a figure of real gravity, a wise and sorrowful mentor, whose counsel carries the weight of a man who lived through the beginning of the very war Aang has to end, who knew Sozin personally, who failed to stop him and has to watch his successor try. Netflix writes Roku looser and goofier, jokier, more casual, and at one point has him dispense advice that sits strangely on an avatar. The notion that friends and attachments are a kind of liability, a weakness the avatar should hold at arm's length. And I find that a genuine misstep because it inverts one of the deepest values of the entire franchise. If there is one thing the cartoon believes down to its bones, it is that Aang's attachments, his love for his friends, his refusal to give people up, are not his weakness but his strength, the very thing that makes him a different and better kind of avatar than the detached, duty-bound incarnations before him. To have a past avatar advise him that attachment is a liability, and to wrap that advice in a jokier, less serious Roku, muddies a theme the original held sacred. It may be setting up a disagreement the show intends to resolve later, Aang learning to reject that cold counsel, and if so, I will happily revise my complaint. But taken on its own, in Season 1, a goofy Roku telling Aang that caring is dangerous is the change I trust least, because it treats as an open question something the cartoon knew was the answer. There is a broader point buried here about how the two shows regard the weight of the past. The cartoon's past avatars are heavy. They are grave, sorrowful, a little frightening, the accumulated seriousness of 1,000 lifetimes pressing down on one child. That heaviness is the point. It is supposed to feel like a lot to carry. The remake, in loosening Roku and diversifying the past lives into a broader cast of guides, distributes that weight differently, makes the chain of avatars more of an ensemble and less of a burden. Some of that is good. Kyoshi as a fierce warrior spirit who fights through Aang is a wonderful image, and giving Aang more than one predecessor to reckon with opens up the mythology. But something of the crushing solemnity, the sense that being the avatar means being haunted by a long line of the dead who expect a great deal of you, gets a little lost when one of those dead is cracking jokes and telling you your friends are a problem. The cartoon made the past a weight. The remake, at least with Roku, made it lighter, and I am not sure the story is better for having set that weight down. That question of Aang's power leads straight into what I think is the boldest single reinvention of his character, which is what the remake decides he is afraid of. Every good version of Aang is built around a fear, because a hero without a fear is just a set of abilities. In the cartoon, Aang's central fear, at least in Book 1, is firebending. And the show gives that fear a precise and painful origin. There is an episode where Aang, eager and impatient, tries to learn firebending too early from a reclusive master. And in a moment of carelessness, he loses control of the flame and burns Katara, the person he loves most, scarring her hands before Aang's healing water can undo it. The horror of that moment, of having hurt the person he most wanted to protect, with the very power he is supposed to master, gives Aang a deep terror of fire that shadows him for a long time. It is a beautifully concrete fear. He is afraid of firebending because he has already used it to hurt someone he loves. And that single accident teaches him and us that his power is not just a gift but a danger. Netflix reframes the fear entirely. Instead of building Aang's terror around firebending and the burning of Katara, the remake makes his central fear the avatar state itself, his own raw power, the thing that takes him over and does tremendous things through him that he cannot control or remember. In the live action, what frightens Aang is not one element, but the whole overwhelming force of what he is. The way the avatar state can seize him and unleash a power so vast it terrifies him. The fear that when he becomes fully the avatar, he stops being Aang. And this ties directly back to everything we have been building tonight. The withheld waterbending, the sparing use of his abilities, Kyoshi reaching through him to fight. The remake has softly organized its entire vision of Aang around the idea that his power scares him, that the boy is frightened of the god inside him. I want to give the live action real credit here, because this is one of the changes I think is not just defensible, but honestly strong, maybe the strongest reinvention in the season. Making the avatar state the object of Aang's fear is thematically richer than a fear of one element. It is more central, more permanent, more his. A fear of firebending is a fear of one thing that can, in principle, be overcome by learning to firebend well, which the cartoon does eventually let him do. A fear of the avatar state is a fear of himself, of the very thing that makes him the avatar, and that is a fear he cannot simply train away, because to master it is to accept becoming the enormous, frightening, world-altering being he does not want to be. It makes his whole journey internal in a way that suits a slower, more psychological adaptation. The cartoon's Aang had to learn to control fire. The remake's Aang has to learn to accept his own power without being consumed by it. And that is a deeper, lonelier struggle. It also cleverly patches a hole the remake dug for itself elsewhere. Remember that Netflix removed Aang's guilt about running away, made his disappearance an accident, took away the moral fault that gave cartoon Aang his interior life. Well, here is the replacement. If Aang is not haunted by having run, he can instead be haunted by his own power, afraid of the avatar state, afraid of what he becomes when the god takes over. The remake swapped one source of interior struggle for another, traded guilt about the past for fear of the self, and honestly, of the two swaps we have discussed, this is the one I think comes closest to breaking even. Fearing his own power is a worthy replacement for the guilt of the flight. It is not the same, and I still prefer the ache of the guilt, but it is a real, substantial fear, well suited to the story the remake wants to tell, and it gives Aang a genuine inner life even without the running. This is also why the remake uses the avatar state so sparingly, and that is the other half of this change. In the cartoon, by one count, Aang enters the avatar state something like 9 times across Book 1, though I would treat that figure as approximate rather than gospel. The point is that it happens fairly often, triggered by extreme distress or danger, a fairly regular eruption of power. Netflix dials it way down, letting Aang enter the avatar state only rarely, so that each time it happens, it feels enormous, an event rather than a recurring effect. And this follows naturally from the fear. If the avatar state is the thing Aang is terrified of, then it should not go off casually every other episode. It should be held back, dreaded, and when it finally erupts, it should feel like a dam breaking, like the boy losing himself to the god, momentous and frightening and rare. I think this restraint mostly works, and it is of a piece with the whole design of the season, the hoarding of water, the sparing use of power, the sense of an avatar not yet ready. By making the avatar state rare and terrifying rather than frequent and functional, the remake turns it from a power-up into a horror, from something that saves Aang into something that threatens to erase him. When it does come in the finale, the payoff is real precisely because the show spent the whole season keeping it locked away. The cartoon treated the avatar state partly as spectacle, a thrilling eruption of power you looked forward to. The remake treats it as a loaded gun. Aang is afraid to fire, and the difference is the difference between a show that wants you to enjoy your hero's power and a show that wants you to be a little afraid of it, right alongside him. Let me come back down out of the spirit and the self and onto solid ground. Because the middle of the season, the stops along the road, is where the remake's compression does its heaviest lifting, and it starts on Kyoshi Island. Kyoshi Island in the cartoon is a fairly light, charming stop. It is where Sokka gets humbled by the Kyoshi warriors, that beat we already talked about, and where the group meets Suki, the young warrior who leads them. The village elder there is a man named Oyaji, and Suki herself is a confident, capable fighter, sure of who she is. The leader of an elite unit, a girl entirely at home in her own skin and her own place. She is not longing for anything. She is exactly where she means to be. Netflix reworks her. The live-action Suki becomes a more sheltered figure, a girl who has spent her whole life on this small island and aches to see the wider world beyond it. And that yearning becomes the ground for a slow-burn romantic tension with Sokka, who arrives from outside carrying stories of everywhere she has never been. And the leadership of the island shifts too. The male village elder Oyaji is replaced by Suki's mother, a woman named Yukari, who leads the community, so that Suki's story becomes partly about a daughter under her mother's wing, sheltered and watched over, dreaming of the horizon. There is a warmth to this reinvention I do not want to dismiss. Giving Suki a longing, a mother, a reason to be drawn to Sokka beyond simple attraction makes her more of a rounded person and less of a cool guest star, and the slow burn with Sokka is sweet in its way. But I do miss the original Suki's self-possession. Cartoon Suki was magnetic precisely because she wanted nothing from Sokka, because she was his equal or better from the first moment, because her confidence was total and unbothered. Turning her into a sheltered girl who longs to leave makes her softer and, I think, a touch more conventional, a young woman defined partly by what she lacks and yearns for, rather than by what she already fully is. It is the same softening instinct we keep meeting, applied to yet another character, trading a figure of complete self-assurance for a figure of relatable want. Then the road reaches Omashu, and here the compression becomes almost violent, because Netflix takes several completely separate cartoon stories and crushes them into one location. In the original, Omashu is its own episode, the city of Aang's old friend, and the freedom fighter Jet is his own episode somewhere else entirely, a forest and a village and a moral trap. and the mechanist and his son Teo live at the Northern Air Temple in yet another separate story much later. 3 distinct stops, 3 distinct places, 3 distinct arcs. The remake folds all of them into Omashu. Jet's freedom fighters are relocated there, recast as a resistance cell hunting Fire Nation spies inside the city. The mechanist and Teo are pulled out of the Northern Air Temple and resettled in Omashu as well. And Zuko and Iroh, who in the cartoon were nowhere near the Omashu episode, are brought into the city too, tangled into the intrigue. Omashu becomes a hub where half a dozen separate cartoon threads collide. I am honestly divided on the Omashu compression, and I think it is worth being precise about why. On one hand, it is efficient and even elegant in places. Turning Jet's story into an urban resistance plot about spies inside a besieged city is a reasonable way to keep his character and his central moral problem, that he fights the Fire Nation with methods that endanger the innocent without spending a whole standalone episode you do not have. And gathering these threads in one place lets the season keep its momentum, keep its cast interacting, avoid the stop and start rhythm of the cartoon's road trip. On the other hand, something real is lost when 3 worlds become one. In the cartoon, each of those stops was a different place with a different texture, a forest, a mountain temple, a stone city. And part of the wonder of Book 1 is how much of the world you see, how many distinct communities and landscapes the road trip carries you through. Crush them all into Omashu and the world starts to feel smaller, more like a single set redressed, than like a vast continent full of separate lives. You gain narrative economy and you lose the sense of scale, the feeling of a genuinely enormous world unrolling stop by stop. Jet specifically pays a price worth naming. In the cartoon, Jet is one of Book 1's most morally complicated figures, a charismatic young rebel whose hatred of the Fire Nation has curdled into a willingness to drown an entire village of civilians to kill a few soldiers. And his standalone episode gives that terrible ambiguity room to breathe. Compressed into a single Omashu arc about hunting spies, some of that moral weight gets lighter. He is still there, still a warning about what righteous anger can become. But the version of him that could nearly commit an atrocity in the name of the cause has less space to fully damn himself. The remake keeps the character and trims the darkness, which, given how much darkness it added elsewhere, is a slightly ironic place to economize. But the change at Omashu that I have the strongest feelings about is Bumi, and I mostly do not like it, so let me be honest about that. King Bumi in the cartoon is a joy. He is Aang's oldest friend, a boy Aang knew 100 years ago who is now an impossibly ancient king. A cackling, riddling, apparently mad old man who puts Aang through a series of deadly-seeming challenges that turn out to be lessons, and whose whole gleeful lunacy is a mask over one of the sharpest strategic minds in the world. The reveal that this ridiculous, cackling king is secretly a genius and secretly Aang's beloved friend is one of the great warm surprises of Book 1. Bumi is proof that you can be old and powerful and wise and still choose to be silly, that wisdom and play are not enemies. Netflix darkens him almost past recognition. The live-action Bumi is jaded, bitter, harsher, an old king worn down and embittered by 100 years of war, and crucially he blames Aang, openly and with real anger, for having vanished, for having abandoned the world when it needed the Avatar most. His challenges are not whimsical lessons, but sincerely cruel tests, and his final trial forces Aang into a horrifying choice, holding 2 great boulders suspended, one poised over Bumi and one over Aang himself, and demanding that Aang decide who lives. It is a dark, despairing scene, an old friend turned tormentor, and it takes Aang's friends intervening to break it. And unlike the cartoon, where Sokka and Katara are held hostage and immobilized through Bumi's games, the remake lets them stay free and even join the fight. The showrunner has said, more or less, that the goofy Bumi simply did not work in live action, that the cackling madman who reads as delightful in animation would read as merely strange with a real actor's face on him. And I understand the practical reasoning, I truly do, but I still think this is one of the season's saddest losses because Bumi was never only comic relief. His silliness was a philosophy. In a world consumed by a century of war, here was a man who chose joy, who chose play, who chose to greet the returned Avatar with riddles and rock candy instead of blame. And that choice was itself a kind of wisdom. The wisdom of someone who has seen everything and decided that delight is still worth defending. Netflix bitter accusing Bumi is more realistic, sure. 100 years of war probably would embitter a man. But in making him realistic, the remake loses the very thing Bumi was for, the reminder that the war has not conquered everyone, that some old souls keep their lightness on purpose as an act of defiance. The cartoon needed one character who refused to be broken by the world's darkness. The remake, committed above all to seriousness, could not quite let him stay unbroken, and turned the one figure who embodied unbroken joy into one more casualty of the war. Of everything the live-action darkened, that is the darkening I would most want to argue it out of. And so the road ends at the north, at the great walled city of the Northern Water Tribe, where both versions bring their first act to a close, and where the differences pile up thick and fast, because a finale is where every earlier choice comes due. Start with Pakku because he is the through line I promised would come back. The Northern Water Tribe keeps a strict old custom that women may learn only healing, never combat. And Master Pakku, the tribe's greatest waterbending teacher, enforces it absolutely. When Katara demands to be taught to fight, he refuses and she challenges him. And there is a duel, a young woman against a master, fought over nothing less than the right to learn. The remake keeps this. Katara still fights Pakku for the right to learn combat waterbending, and it is still one of the season's strong beats. But remember what we said much earlier, that Netflix removed Sokka's sexism at the start of the season. The result is that the Northern Tribe's prejudice, which in the cartoon was the culmination of a thread running all the way back to Sokka's first dumb comment at the South, now stands more on its own, a wall that appears in the finale without the long runway the original built toward it. The duel still works, it just carries less of the season behind it because the season did less to prepare it. The masonry, as I said before, lost half its foundation, and here at the north you can feel the missing support. Then there is Yue and the tangle of romance and sacrifice around her, which the remake rewires in several places at once. In the cartoon, Princess Yue is betrothed to a young man named Han, and Han is written as an arrogant social climber, a self-important striver who cares about Yue mostly for the status the marriage brings him, a minor jerk whose unworthiness makes it easy to root for Sokka instead. Netflix rehabilitates him completely. The live-action Han is caring, honorable, truly fond of Yue, accepting of her feelings even when they turn elsewhere, a decent young man rather than a preening opportunist. And this is part of a consistent pattern we have watched all night, the remake softening its minor antagonists, removing the easy villains, complicating the people the cartoon let you simply dislike. It is kinder. It is also, I would argue, less useful because sometimes a story wants a Han you can dismiss, a rival with no real claim on your sympathy, so that the romance you're meant to root for has a clear road. Make Han really good, and you muddy the very thing his character existed to make simple. It is a nicer world with a decent Han in it. It is a slightly less efficient love story. The romance itself, Sokka and Yue, gets both regrounded and rushed, and the remake tries to solve the rushing with a clever bit of setup that I have complicated feelings about. In the cartoon, Sokka and Yue fall for each other quickly over the span of the finale. A brief, doomed romance that works largely on the strength of the actors and the tragedy waiting at the end of it. Netflix, aware that a compressed 8-episode season gives this romance even less room, tries to precede it, planting earlier a connection through the spirit world, a fox spirit Sokka encountered that ties, in some fashion, to Yue, so that when the two finally meet, there is a thread of destiny already strung between them. It is an inventive attempt to give a rushed romance some roots, and yet, by most accounts, it still plays as compressed. The love story crammed into something like an episode and a half, the destiny connection a clever patch rather than a full cure. The remake diagnosed the problem correctly, that this romance needs more foundation than the structure allows, and reached for a supernatural shortcut to provide it, and the shortcut helps without quite fixing the underlying squeeze. There is only so much room in 8 episodes, and love, even destined love, needs time the season does not have. Yue's transformation is where the remake's restraint, so often a strength, becomes for me a small disappointment. In the cartoon, when the moon spirit is killed and Yue gives her life to restore it, her death is rendered as something transcendent and beautiful. She becomes a glowing white figure, luminous, the moon spirit made flesh, and she shares a final kiss with Sokka before she ascends, a moment of aching, glamorous, mythic tragedy. Netflix downplays it. The live-action Yue simply submerges into the sacred waters and becomes the white koi fish, the physical vessel of the moon spirit, without the radiant glowing transformation and without the final kiss. It is quieter, more literal, more grounded. And I understand the impulse toward restraint, the wish to avoid a moment that might read as too much, too operatic with real actors. But this is a case where I think the cartoon's operatic excess was right and the remake's restraint was wrong. Yue's death is supposed to be transcendent. It is a princess becoming the moon. If ever a story earned a glowing, glamorous, larger-than-life farewell, it is this one. And by grounding it, by trading the luminous ascension and the last kiss for a simple submersion, the remake makes a mythic sacrifice feel almost ordinary. Sometimes too much is exactly the right amount, and a girl turning into the moon is one of those times. Now, the death that was reworked most heavily is Zhao's, and here the two versions diverge in a way that says something about each. In the cartoon, after Zhao commits the unforgivable act of killing the moon spirit, the ocean spirit rises in fury, and it is the ocean spirit itself, the vast watery wrath of nature that seizes Zhao and drags him down into the deep, a cosmic punishment for a cosmic crime. And in a startling grace note, Zuko, who has every reason to hate Zhao, actually reaches out and tries to save him. And Zhao, too proud even at the end, refuses the hand and is pulled under. It is a moment that tells you everything about who Zuko is becoming, that even for his enemy, he will not simply let a man drown. Netflix rewrites the mechanics and the meaning both. In the live action, Zhao dies during a direct confrontation with Zuko, and it is Iroh who ends him, knocking Zhao into the freezing water where he drowns after Zhao twists the knife by taunting Zuko that Ozai never actually wanted him back as heir, that the whole quest was a lie, that there was never a homecoming waiting. I find this change fascinating rather than simply better or worse, so let me sit with both readings. What the cartoon's version has is that grace note, Zuko trying to save his enemy, a small, beautiful proof of the prince's buried decency, and the mythic justice of nature itself claiming the man who murdered the moon. What the remake's version has is a sharper, emotional blade. By having Zhao die taunting Zuko about his father's rejection, and by having Iroh be the one to kill him, the live action turned Zhao's death into a moment about the Zuko and Iroh relationship, about an uncle protecting his nephew, about a cruel truth spoken at the worst possible moment. It is more personal and less cosmic. The cartoon let the ocean spirit take Zhao, making his death a matter between the man and the universe he violated. The remake let Iroh take Zhao, making his death a matter between a family and the man tormenting it. One is bigger, one is more intimate. And the remake's choice to have Zhao spend his last breath telling Zuko the truth about Ozai's rejection is honestly cutting, planting a seed of doubt in Zuko about the entire premise of his quest, which is a smart, painful piece of setup for the disillusionment to come. But here is the crucial thing to hold on to, because it is easy to get swept up in the differences and miss it. The climax of the whole siege, the great fusion, is the same in both. When the moon spirit dies and all hope seems lost, Aang merges with the ocean spirit, becoming an enormous glowing water giant, a colossus of ocean and rage, and destroys the Fire Nation fleet. Both shows do this. Both shows give you that towering water spirit wearing Aang like a heart at its center, sweeping the invaders into the sea. So when you hear all these changes at the North, do not let anyone tell you the remake abandoned the finale's great image. It kept it. The ocean spirit fusion, the water colossus, the annihilation of the fleet. That is a point of agreement, a place where the two versions look at the same overwhelming spectacle, and both decide, yes, that, we keep that. It is worth naming the similarities loudly because in a video about differences, it is the shared moments that remind you these really are the same story, told twice, by two shows with two souls. And then the handoff, the way each version points toward what comes next. The remake closes its first season by flagging its future threats plainly, that Azula has been sent to conquer Omashu, turning the city we just spent time in into a target, and that Sazin's Comet, the very engine the cartoon used from the start, is returning after its 100-year cycle, finally arming the deadline the remake declined to use in Season 1. So the Comet does come back into play, Netflix simply saved it, holding the franchise's best clock in reserve, letting Season 1 run on Kyoshi's nearer prophecy, and then, at the very end, winding up the great countdown for the seasons still to come. It is a patient structure, and whether the patience pays off is a question the later seasons have to answer. But it tells you the remake always knew what it was doing with the Comet. It did not forget the clock, it just decided when to start it. Before we leave the first season behind and look at the production that shaped it, I want to step back from the individual changes and talk about the thing that sits underneath all of them. The overall tone, because if you watch the two shows back to back, the very first thing your body notices, before you can even name a single plot difference, is that they feel completely different to be inside. The cartoon is, at its base, a comedy adventure that happens to be about a war. Yes, it goes to dark places, the genocide, Zuko's scar, Yue's death, and it never trivializes them. But its default register is light. It is funny, it is warm. It lets Sokka crack jokes in the middle of danger, lets Momo the lemur and Appa the sky bison have entire comic subplots, lets the kids be kids even as they carry the fate of the world. The lightness is not a failure of seriousness, it is a deliberate philosophy, the belief that a story about children saving the world should feel, much of the time, like being a child, full of play and food and silliness, so that the dark moments land all the harder against that brightness. The cartoon earns its tragedy by surrounding it with joy. Netflix pulls the tone down and darkens it across the board. The live action is more violent, more grim, more willing to show blood and death and the real brutality of wartime. People die on screen who, in the cartoon, died off it or not at all. The comedy is dialed back, the goofier beats thinned out, the antics of Momo and Appa reduced to make room for a heavier, more serious mood. It wants to feel like a war drama that happens to have magic in it, where the cartoon felt like a magical adventure that happened to have a war in it. And that inversion, adventure with a war inside versus war with an adventure inside, is maybe the cleanest way to describe the whole gulf between them. I have spent this entire video trying to be fair to both shows, and I mean to keep doing that here, so let me give the darkening its due before I say what troubles me about it. There is a real argument that the cartoon, constrained by being a Nickelodeon children's program in the mid-2000s, had to keep certain horrors at arm's length, and that a modern adaptation for a general audience can finally show the war with the seriousness it deserves, can let the genocide be a genocide, and the deaths be deaths without the softening a kids' network demanded. Seen that way, the remake is not gratuitously grim. It is honest about a story that was always, underneath, extremely dark. A tale of a 100-year war and a wiped-out people and a child soldier of a prince. The live action lets the material be as heavy as it always secretly was. But here is what troubles me, and it is the thing I keep circling back to. The cartoon's lightness was not a limitation it suffered, it was a strength it chose. The reason the dark moments in the original hit so hard, the reason Yue's death and Iroh's grief and the empty air temple can still level a grown adult 20 years later, is precisely that they arrive in a show that is otherwise full of warmth and laughter and play. Tragedy needs contrast. A sad moment in a relentlessly grim show is just more of the same, one more dark beat in a dark hour. A sad moment in a joyful show is a rupture, a sudden hole opening in the sunlight, and that rupture is where the real feeling lives. By darkening everything, by lowering the baseline mood to match the heavy moments, the remake risks flattening its own emotional range, making the whole thing one even shade of serious, so that when the actually devastating beats come, they have less brightness to fall from. You cannot feel the depth of a valley if you never see a peak. And there is a subtler cost, one that goes to the heart of what these characters are. They are children. Aang is 12. Sokka and Katara are teenagers. Part of the quiet miracle of the cartoon is that it never forgets this, never lets the weight of the world fully rob these kids of their childhood, insists that even in the middle of a war, they still play, still joke, still find joy, because that is what children do, and that is what makes the war they are fighting worth fighting. The lightness is thematic. It is the show arguing that the point of defeating the Fire Nation is to preserve a world where children can still be children. When the remake darkens the tone and thins the comedy, it does not just change the mood. It slightly ages the characters past their years, makes these kids feel more like grim young soldiers and less like children carrying an impossible burden. And in doing so, it loses a little of the specific poignancy of watching children shoulder, something they should never have had to. The tragedy of the cartoon is partly that they are so young. Make them grimmer and you make them older, and something tender goes out of it. I do not want to overstate this because the remake is not humorless, and there are real pleasures in its heavier register, a genuine sense of danger, a weight to the violence that makes the stakes feel physical in a way animation sometimes cannot. When the live action wants you to feel that this war is real and terrible, it succeeds, and there is value in that. But if you asked me to name the single quality the cartoon had that the remake most conspicuously lacks, I would not say it was any plot point or any character beat. I would say it was joy. The original was, for all its darkness, a joyful show. And that joy was load-bearing, and the remake, in its sincere pursuit of maturity and weight, set a great deal of that joy aside. Growing up does not have to mean growing grim. The cartoon knew that. It is the lesson at the center of its whole worldview, and it is the lesson I most wish the adaptation had carried across. Now, everything I have described tonight, every softened flaw and every darkened tone and every reshuffled villain, sits on top of one production fact that explains more than any single creative choice. And I have deliberately saved it for here, so that you would already know the shape of the changes before you learn the circumstance behind them. The two people who created Avatar, The Last Airbender, Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, the men whose vision the original cartoon is, had no hand in the Netflix show that aired. They were originally attached to the live-action adaptation. They came aboard to shepherd it, to be the creative guardians of their own world. And then, in 2020, they left. The departure was announced publicly in August of that year, after they had stepped away a couple of months earlier. And the reason they gave, in their own words, was creative differences, a sense that the production had become, as they described it, a negative and unsupportive environment, one in which their vision for the adaptation was not going to be honored. They walked away from the screen version of the story they had spent years of their lives building, and the show that eventually reached Netflix was made without them, with no creative control in the hands of the people who dreamed the whole thing up in the first place. I want to be careful and neutral here because these are real people, and I am not interested in gossip about anyone's private feelings or motives beyond what they themselves chose to say publicly. What I can tell you is documented and no more. They were attached, they left over creative differences, they described the environment as unsupportive, and the show aired without them. Those are the facts, and I will not dress them up with speculation about who was right or what happened behind closed doors, because I do not know, and neither does anyone commenting from the outside. But knowing those facts changes how you read every difference we have discussed, and that is why they matter. When you understand that the architects of the original walked away, the pattern of the changes starts to look less like a series of isolated creative decisions and more like the natural result of a different set of hands. The people who made the remake were, by all accounts, sincere admirers of the cartoon. This was not a hostile takeover by people who despised the source, but they were not the source. And so, again and again, you see them reaching for what a respectful, talented outside team would reach for. A darker tone that reads as more serious, softened protagonists who are easier to root for. Front-loaded lore that shows off the depth of the world. Villains pulled forward to give a short season more menace. These are the choices of skilled adapters trying to honor a beloved thing from the outside. The specific, sometimes counterintuitive wisdom of the original, the willingness to let a hero be a coward, to keep a villain hidden, to make a tragedy funny, that wisdom lived partly in the two people who are no longer in the room. You cannot fully outsource an author's instincts, and the gap between the two shows is, in a real sense, the gap their absence left. The show running itself passed through more than one set of hands. The first season was run by Albert Kim, who steered the adaptation to screen. The seasons that follow are guided by Christine Boylan and Jabbar Raisani, a change at the top between the first season and the rest, which is its own kind of instability, a story about the founding of a world being handed from one steward to another and then another. Adaptations tend to be strongest when a single, stubborn vision drives them from beginning to end. And this one has had to change drivers, first losing its original creators, then changing showrunners for its later seasons. That is a lot of hands on one wheel, and some of the unevenness people feel in the remake may simply be the fingerprints of all those different hands. As for how it landed, the reception tells a fairly clear story if you read it honestly. The first season drew mixed reviews, sitting around 62% on the main critical aggregator, with a consistent split running through nearly every write-up. Praise for the visual effects and the production design, and several of the performances, especially the work on Zuko and Iroh, set against real criticism of the pacing and the writing. Exactly the areas where the compression and the tonal changes we have discussed did their damage. The second season drew warmer reviews from critics, climbing into the low 70s, a real step up from the first season's 62, even as its audience scores ran cooler. And taken together, that suggested the show had found slightly surer footing as it went. And in raw viewership, the launch was enormous. By the reporting at the time, the show pulled something in the neighborhood of 154 million hours watched in its first week. A genuinely massive debut that made it, by the numbers, a hit, regardless of the critical split. People showed up in droves. Whether they were fully satisfied is a murkier question, but they came. And I cannot talk about the reception of this show without acknowledging the ghost it was measured against, because context is everything here. 16 years ago, there was another attempt to bring this cartoon into live action, the 2010 feature film directed by M. Night Shyamalan, and it is, by wide agreement, one of the most reviled adaptations in modern memory. A film so poorly received that its name became shorthand for how badly this particular story could be mangled. So the Netflix series was never really being judged against the cartoon alone. It was being judged against that catastrophe, against the memory of a beloved world reduced to a punchline on the big screen. And measured against that ghost, the Netflix show is a clear and undeniable success. It looks right, it casts right, drawing on the Asian and indigenous heritage the material is rooted in, rather than erasing it the way the film infamously did. It treats the story with respect. Simply by not being the film, it cleared a bar the film had buried underground. And much of the goodwill the series enjoyed came from that relief, the sense that at last someone had done this thing without desecrating it, which leaves the remake in an interesting and slightly poignant position. And it is where I want to land this whole thread. It is better than the film by a wide margin, and it is not the cartoon, and it lives in the space between those two facts. It cleared the low bar spectacularly and fell short of the high one, and both of those things are true at once, and neither cancels the other. It is a respectful, handsome, sincere, uneven adaptation made by people who loved the original but were not the original, of a story whose creators had left the building. And if you keep all of that in mind, the film it is not, and the cartoon it is not, and the absent authors it was made without, then the differences we have spent all this time on stop looking like a list of mistakes and start looking like something sadder and more human. The honest, flawed, well-meaning attempt of one group of artists to carry another group's masterpiece across a gap that maybe could never quite be closed. Which brings us, at last, out of the first book and into the second, because the Netflix show did not stop at the North. Its second season arrived in the summer of 2026, adapting the cartoon's Book 2, Earth, and it takes the compression we watched in the first season and pushes it even harder. So let me walk you through the broad strokes, keeping in mind that the fine detail of these newer episodes is still settling. And I would rather tell you what is clearly true than pretend to a precision I do not have. The headline is the same as before, only more so. The cartoon's Book 2 is 20 episodes. The Netflix second season is 7. That is an even steeper reduction than Book 1's 20 into 8, and it forces the story into a shape almost unrecognizable from the original's leisurely march across the Earth Kingdom. In the cartoon, Book 2 is a long, slow journey toward the great walled city of Ba Sing Se. And the whole point is the journey, all the stops and detours and encounters along the way, so that by the time the group finally reaches the city, it feels like the end of an enormous trek. The remake collapses the journey. Team Avatar reaches Ba Sing Se far earlier, and events that were once wayside stops on the road now happen after they have already arrived, reordered and relocated to fit inside the walls. The Serpent's Pass, for instance, which comes around the midpoint of the cartoon's second book, is pulled all the way forward into the very first episode of the Netflix season. The road trip becomes a city story, and a great deal of the middle of Book 2 simply evaporates, or gets folded into something else. The reordering does something subtle to the emotional architecture that is worth naming, because it is not only a matter of moving pieces around a board. In the cartoon, reaching Ba Sing Se is a destination the whole season has been aching toward, so that arriving there carries the weight of a long pilgrimage completed, and the terrible discovery that the great city is rotten from within, that its government hides the war and controls its own people, lands with the force of a promised land turning out to be a prison. When you collapse the journey and get the heroes inside the walls early, you spend that arrival cheaply. The city becomes a setting they occupy rather than a horizon they finally reach, and the slow dread of discovering its corruption has less room to build because they have not earned the arrival with a season of hardship on the road. The remake keeps the fact of Ba Sing Se's rot. It cannot quite keep the feeling of having crossed a continent to find it, which was a large part of what made the rot so devastating in the original. And a lot does evaporate. Several of the cartoon's most memorable Book 2 episodes are not directly adapted at all. The great mechanical drill assaulting the city walls, the long desert crossing, the wandering swamp, the guru who teaches Aang to open his chakras, and, most painfully for many fans, the episode following Appa after he is stolen. All of these are either cut or reduced to fragments folded into other scenes. The entire Siwang Desert storyline, one of the cartoon's most distinctive stretches, is largely erased, and with it goes the sandbending, the desert tribes who bend the dunes themselves, an entire sub-discipline of earthbending that the remake sets aside. When you remove the desert, you remove a whole texture of the world, and Book 2's desert was one of its strangest and most haunting textures, a place where the show got sincerely bleak and strange. Losing it is losing a color the palette can ill afford. The knock-on effects of these cuts are where it gets interesting, because you cannot simply delete an episode of a tightly woven story without the removal rippling outward. Take the great library of Wan Shu Tong, the knowledge-hoarding owl spirit we already met crossing the remake's spirit world in Season 1. In the cartoon, his library is buried under the Siwang Desert, and finding it is the whole reason for the desert crossing. Cut the desert and the library has nowhere to be, so the remake relocates it, tying it instead to Ba Sing Se and the spirit world, and the scholar who guided the heroes to it in the cartoon, Professor Zay, has his role altered to fit the new geography. It is a sensible patch. It also quietly unmoors one of the franchise's eeriest locations from the landscape that gave it meaning, turning a lost temple in the deep desert into something more abstract. The loss I find most consequential, though, is the guru. In the cartoon, a huge part of Aang's Book 2 arc is spiritual. He seeks out a guru named Pathik who teaches him to open his chakras, the energy centers within him, as the path to fully mastering the avatar state, and this spiritual training is not a side quest. It is central because it sets up the terrible choice at the end of the season, whether Aang can let go of his earthly attachments, specifically his love for Katara, in order to gain complete control of his power. Netflix, having no room for a mountaintop guru in a 7-episode season, removes Pathik entirely, and with him the whole chakra opening arc disappears. And that is a significant subtraction because it strips out one of the cartoon's deepest engagements with its own themes, the idea that ultimate power requires a kind of letting go that Aang, a boy who loves too fiercely to let anything go, cannot bring himself to perform. The remake keeps the emotional collision at the end of the season, as we will see, but it removes the spiritual scaffolding the cartoon built to give that collision meaning. The choice remains. The philosophy behind it thins. Appa's story suffers a similar deflation. In the cartoon, the sky bison is stolen and he is gone for a long, aching stretch, and the show devotes an entire late episode to Appa's own ordeal, his suffering and his loneliness while separated from the family who loves him. And it is one of the more heartbreaking things the series ever did, a story that made a fictional animal into a genuine emotional gut punch. The remake, compressing hard, has Appa taken later and returned sooner under different circumstances, so that the long separation and the devoted episode following his misery are gone. Appa comes back before the loss has time to fully land, and the emotional weight the cartoon squeezed out of that absence largely dissipates. It is a smaller version of the same thing that happened to Bumi and to the desert, the remake trading the cartoon's willingness to dwell, to linger in a feeling until it becomes unbearable, for a faster, cleaner forward motion that does not have time to ache. Not everything in the second season is subtraction, though, and some of the additions and reworkings are truly intriguing. Toph finally arrives since she was never in the first season, and the remake reworks her a little, making her somewhat older and leaning harder into her family, her mother especially, and into the uncomfortable fact that the Beifongs, her wealthy family, are shown profiting from the very war tearing the world apart. That last touch is a sharp, sad addition, the blind runaway daughter of a family growing rich on the misery around them. And it gives Toph's rebellion an economic and moral edge the cartoon touched more lightly. Katara, meanwhile, gets a new thread pulled forward from much later in the franchise. Inside Ba Sing Se, she takes up a kind of masked vigilante identity, moving through the city helping refugees, a concept clearly borrowed from a Book 3 cartoon story about a disguised healer known as the Painted Lady, relocated here to the Earth Kingdom capital and repurposed as Katara's response to the suffering she sees in the city. It is a real invention, giving Katara her own active arc inside Ba Sing Se rather than leaving her a passenger in the political plot. And I rather like the impulse behind it, even where it plays a little strangely out of its original context. Jet gets a different ending than the cartoon gave him too. In the original, Jet's Book 2 story ends in tragedy through the Dai Li, the secret police of Ba Sing Se, who brainwash him, and his death is bound up with the city's sinister mind control conspiracy. The remake reroutes him, giving him a different redemption arc that ends in sacrifice during the mission to the library rather than in brainwashing and a murky death in the catacombs. It is a cleaner, more heroic exit for a character the first season had already simplified, and whether you prefer the cartoon's bleaker, more ambiguous fate for him, or the remake's more redemptive one probably depends on how much you value Jet as a warning versus Jet as a fallen hero. The conspiracy of Ba Sing Se itself, the whole vast, unsettling machinery of a city where the war is a forbidden secret and a shadow government controls everything, gets condensed. Long Feng, the spy master at the center of it, turns the members of Team Avatar against each other by exposing their secrets, driving the heroes to a low point through division rather than through the cartoon's slower, creeping dread, and the elaborate Dai Li and Earth King intrigue is simplified into something the short season can carry. And around the edges, the remake expands certain backstories it clearly finds rich, giving more room to Zuko and his mother Ursa, and deepening the origin of his Blue Spirit identity, the masked persona we saw him wear to rescue Aang back in the first season. The compression, in other words, is not only cutting, it is also choosing, spending its scarce time on the threads it judges most worth deepening while letting the rest fall away. The second season saves its single most consequential change for the very end, for the moment that has to carry the whole show into its darkest hour. And it is worth slowing all the way down for because it is the boldest gamble the remake has made so far. In the cartoon, Book 2 ends with one of the most shocking sequences in the entire series. Beneath Ba Sing Se, in a vast cavern of glowing green crystal, Aang finally begins to rise into the Avatar state, gathering the full power he has been struggling toward all season. And at the instant of his greatest strength, Azula strikes him from behind with a bolt of lightning. He falls. For a moment, the impossible seems to have happened. The Avatar appears to be dead, and Katara catches his limp body as they flee, and it is only because she carries a small vial of sacred water from the spirit oasis at the North Pole, water with healing power, that she is able to revive him. He survives barely, and by the opening of Book 3, he has recovered. But the image of Aang struck down at the height of his power, saved only by a vial of holy water, is seared into every fan's memory as the moment the show proved it would go anywhere. Netflix reworks the staging, the mechanics, and most importantly, the resolution. The confrontation is moved to Lake Laogai, another location tied to the Dai Li and the secrets of Ba Sing Se, and the emotional shape of Aang's fall is rebuilt. In the live action, Aang enters the Avatar state and, poised to unleash it against Azula, hesitates. He cannot bring himself to kill her. And in that moment of hesitation, that flicker of the mercy that defines him, Azula strikes him with her lightning. So where the cartoon's Aang is struck by surprise, From behind, at the peak of his power, the remake's Aang is struck because he would not kill, because his compassion left an opening, which is a meaningfully different tragedy, a hero brought down not by an ambush but by his own unwillingness to do the very thing his power was made for. And the remake adds a piece of lore weight to the moment that raises the stakes enormously. It emphasizes, clearly and deliberately, that to die while in the Avatar state is not an ordinary death. It would break the cycle. If the Avatar is killed while the Avatar state is active, the chain of reincarnation that has run through thousands of lifetimes ends permanently, and there is no next Avatar ever. So when Azula's lightning hits Aang in the Avatar state, the remake is not just threatening the death of one boy, it is threatening the death of the Avatar itself. The extinction of the entire cosmic institution the whole story rests upon, the severing of a line that stretches back to the beginning of the world. That is a really enormous escalation of the stakes, and I think it is one of the smartest things the remake does with the material, taking a shocking death fake-out and layering onto it a metaphysical catastrophe that makes the danger feel civilizational rather than personal. Then comes the choice that truly separates the two versions, and it is a matter of nerve. In the cartoon, Katara's spirit water works. Aang is revived. The show pulls him back from the edge, and while the image of his near death lingers, the fact of his survival is not in doubt for long. Netflix refuses you that certainty. In the live action, Katara tries the sacred spirit oasis water, the same last resort the cartoon used, and the healing does not visibly take. The season ends with Aang unconscious, unresponsive, his fate left deliberately ambiguous, the final shot withholding the reassurance the cartoon provided. You do not get to know at the close of the season whether the Avatar will wake. The remake ends its second act on a genuine question mark hanging over the life of its hero, and given the lore it just established, over the survival of the entire Avatar cycle. I go back and forth on whether this ambiguity is brave or merely a cliffhanger for its own sake, so let me give you the honest split. On the side of brave, it is a real gut punch, and it fits everything the remake has been doing. The darker tone, the heavier stakes, the willingness to leave you in the dark rather than hand you comfort. Ending a season with your hero possibly dead and the reincarnation cycle possibly broken is about as low and as frightening a point as this story can reach, and it earns a genuine dread. On the side of cheaper, we all know, more or less, that Aang cannot really be gone, that there are more seasons coming, that the show is not going to end the Avatar line with a shrug, and so the ambiguity is, on some level, a suspense the audience knows will resolve in the hero's favor. The cartoon, by letting the spirit water work, at least stated plainly what had happened and moved forward. The remake holds the question open partly for the thrill of holding it open. Which of those you find it to be probably depends on how much you enjoy a cliffhanger you are fairly sure you can predict. Whatever you think of the ambiguity, the surrounding devastation is real and it is total, and this is where the remake lands its second season with genuine weight. Ba Sing Se, the last great stronghold of the Earth Kingdom, the impregnable city, has fallen to Azula. The conspiracy has collapsed the city from within and handed it to the Fire Nation. Iroh, the warm heart of the whole show, has been captured and imprisoned. And Team Avatar, broken and diminished with their avatar unconscious and maybe dying in Katara's arms, flees the fallen city on Appa's back into an uncertain dark. It is the hero's lowest point, the bottom of the whole story, the moment when everything they have fought for seems lost and the enemy holds the world. The cartoon's book, too, ended in a similar darkness. The great city fallen, and the Avatar struck down, so the remake is faithful to the despair of the original's midpoint. It simply pushes the despair a shade further, holds the hope a shade tighter, and sets up its final season, with the returning comet and the coming eclipse of the Day of Black Sun already looming, as the climb back out of the deepest hole the story has ever dug. And with the third season still ahead, the one meant to conclude the whole adaptation, we are, all of us, watching from the same place the heroes are in the dark, not yet knowing whether the light comes back. Having walked through both seasons, I want to pull back and name the single largest difference of all, the one that every other change is really a symptom of. Because if you understand this one, you understand the whole gap. It is not a plot point or a character, it is a shape. It is the difference between an episodic show and a serialized one. The cartoon is episodic in the oldest and most generous sense. It is a road trip, and it moves the way road trips move, one destination at a time, with each stop more or less its own small story. Team Avatar arrives somewhere, meets someone, faces a problem particular to that place, resolves it or fails to, and moves on, carrying a little more growth and a few more friends. Some of these stops are load-bearing for the larger plot, and some are almost pure detour. An episode about a canyon and a feud, an episode about a fortune teller and a village, an episode about a runaway and a Fire Nation prison. There is a whole cartoon episode about a great canyon and the two warring refugee groups who have to cross it, widely regarded as the weakest half hour the show ever made, and the fact that the show could afford a week standalone and simply move past it is itself a feature of the form. The road trip structure means no single stop has to carry everything, because there is always another town over the next hill. This structure is doing something the remake's fans, and even some of its makers, may not fully credit. The wandering is how the cartoon builds its world. Every detour is a window into another corner of this vast, war-torn, beautiful place, another community with its own troubles, another texture of the four nations. The Great Divide and its feuding refugees, the episode about the siblings' father's old friend Bato of the Water Tribe, the deserter who teaches Aang a hard lesson about fire, the prison full of captured earthbenders, the fortune teller's village, all of these are standalone stories the remake either cuts entirely or dissolves into a line of dialogue somewhere. And individually, sure, you can lose any one of them and survive. The Great Divide nobody will miss. But collectively, they are the connective tissue that makes the world feel enormous and lived in, that makes you believe there is a whole continent of ordinary people out there with lives that go on whether or not the Avatar passes through. Strip the detours and you keep the plot, but you lose the planet. Netflix is serialized, which is the dominant grammar of prestige streaming television, and serialization has real virtues I do not want to wave away. A serialized show is one long, escalating story rather than a string of self-contained ones, every episode feeding the next, the tension mounting continuously, the arcs threading straight through without pause. It is bingeable in a way the cartoon's episodic rhythm is not, built for an audience that will watch 8 hours in a weekend and wants each hour to end on a hook that pulls them into the next. It keeps the whole cast active and the central plot always advancing, and for a story with as strong a spine as this one, the war, the Avatar's growth, Zuko's redemption, serialization can sharpen the through line, can make the momentum relentless, in a way the cartoon's wandering deliberately was not. But here is the trade at the deepest level, and it is the trade underneath every specific change we have discussed tonight. Serialization abhors a detour. In a show where every episode must feed the central plot, there is no room for the standalone story that exists just to show you a corner of the world or to let the characters breathe. The canyon episode, the fortune teller, the deserter, all the little windows, they have to go because they do not advance the main line, and the main line is now the only line. So the world contracts. It stops being a continent you tour and becomes a plot you follow. And every softened character, every merged location, every front-loaded villain, every compressed romance is downstream of this one structural fact, that a serialized 8-episode season simply cannot hold what an episodic 20-episode season held, and so it keeps the spine and sheds the flesh. I have come to think this is the truest way to understand the whole comparison, more useful than any list of individual changes. The cartoon believed that a story could afford to wander, that the detours were not a distraction from the point, but part of the point, that you come to love a world by spending unhurried time in its unimportant corners. The remake believes, as almost all modern television believes, that a story should drive, that every scene should pull toward the climax, that a well-made show is one you cannot stop watching rather than one you never want to leave. Those are not the same value. A show you cannot stop watching and a show you never want to leave are, it turns out, built very differently, and the cartoon was the second kind while the remake is trying hard to be the first. And if I'm honest about my own heart, this is where I most feel the loss, more than any single scene. What I loved about the cartoon was not only its plot, it was the sense that I could go and live there. The that the world was bigger than the story, that around every character the Avatar met, there was a whole life the show respected enough to spend an episode on, even when the war could have waited. The remake is a good adaptation of the plot of Avatar. But the plot was never quite the thing. The thing was the world, and the world lived in the wandering, and the wandering is the one thing a serialized structure cannot keep. You can compress a genocide into a scene, and a romance into an episode, and a villain into an early reveal, and lose something each time but survive. What you cannot do is compress a road trip and still have a road trip. The moment you make it drive, it stops being the journey it was, and the journey, for me, was always the whole point. I have spent most of this video cataloging what changed, because that is the assignment, and because differences are simply more interesting to talk about than sameness. But it would be a dishonest portrait of the remake if I let you come away thinking it changed everything, because it did not, and the things it kept tell you just as much about what these two shows understood to be essential. So let me spend some real time on what stayed the same, because a remake reveals its priorities as much by what it refuses to touch as by what it rebuilds. Start with the bones of the world, because the remake kept them exactly. The four nations are the four nations. The bending is the bending, water and earth and fire and air, each with its own movement and philosophy, each tied to a people and a way of life. The Avatar is still the one soul reborn across all four, the bridge between the human and spirit worlds, cycling through the elements life after life. Aang is still the last of the Air Nomads, the boy out of time. Appa is still a flying sky bison, and Momo is still a winged lemur, and the remake, for all its darkening, did not have the poor taste to cut the animals or pretend the world was too serious for a six-legged bison and a big-eared lemur. The entire cosmology, the whole architecture of how this universe works, comes across intact, and that matters because it would have been the easiest thing in the world to start second-guessing the fundamentals, and the remake had the wisdom not to. It understood that you do not rebuild the foundation, you rebuild the house on top of it. Then there is the casting, which I touched on earlier and want to return to because it is the single most important thing the remake got right, and it got it right precisely by being faithful where the 2010 film had been faithless. The original cartoon was built on a foundation of Asian and indigenous cultures, its aesthetics and philosophies, and movements drawn with real love from those traditions. And the infamous film erased that, casting white actors in the lead roles in a decision that became a byword for everything wrong with Hollywood adaptation. The Netflix show corrected the record completely. Its cast is drawn from the Asian and indigenous heritage the material was always rooted in. It's Aang and Katara and Sokka and Zuko and Iroh embodied by actors who belong to the cultures the story honors. And that is not a small fidelity. It is arguably the one thing that matters most about the entire production, the thing that lets the remake stand as a genuine act of respect toward the source rather than a theft of it. Whatever the show got wrong in pacing or tone, on this, the thing that matters most, it stood exactly where the cartoon stood. The great emotional engines of the story are kept too, and kept largely whole. Zuko's arc, the wounded, exiled prince slowly turning from the pursuit of a father's love toward something better, is preserved as the beating heart of the whole thing, and the remake protects it more carefully than almost anything else. Understanding, correctly, that if you break Zuko, you break the show. Iroh's love for his nephew, the gentle uncle refusing to give up on the angry boy, survives intact and is, if anything, one of the remake's warmest achievements. Aang's defining compassion, his refusal to kill, his insistence on protecting even those who do not deserve it, remains the core of who he is. And the second season finale, as we saw, actually builds a whole tragedy out of that compassion, letting his unwillingness to kill Azula be the very thing that fells him. The found family at the center, 3 and then 4 and then more kids who become each other's whole world, is preserved. These are the load-bearing emotional structures, and the remake left them standing. Even some of the specific climaxes are shared, which I flagged earlier and want to underline again because it cuts against the whole narrative of a remake that changed everything. The great fusion at the north, Aang merging with the ocean spirit into a towering water colossus to destroy the Fire Nation fleet. That is in both shows more or less the same overwhelming image. Yue's sacrifice, the princess giving her life to restore the murdered moon spirit, saved as an infant by that same spirit's life energy and repaying the debt with her death. The mechanism is identical in both. Zhao dies at the Siege of the North in both, whatever the difference is in exactly how the water takes him. Ba Sing Se falls and Aang is struck down by Azula's lightning at the end of the second book in both, whatever the difference is in the staging and the aftermath. The skeleton of the story, the great beats that everyone remembers, the remake hit nearly all of them. It rearranged the approach to each and reworked the details around them. But the beats themselves, the moments you would list if someone asked you what happens in Avatar, are largely there. And this is the thing I most want you to carry out of tonight because it complicates the easy version of this comparison. The easy version is that the cartoon is the good one and the remake is the lesser copy, and that the differences are all failures. But that is not quite true, and it is not fair. The remake kept the foundation, kept the casting faith the film betrayed, kept the emotional core, kept the great beats. Where it changed things, it usually changed them for understandable reasons. The brutal math of 20 episodes becoming 8, the grammar of serialized streaming, the sincere belief that a modern audience needed the war made heavier and the heroes made softer. Some of those changes I mourn. Some of them, the 41st Division as Zuko's crew, the Avatar state as Aang's central fear, Kyoshi fighting through his body, I honestly admire. Most of them are trades, gains bought with losses, and reasonable people can weigh those trades differently. What the remake could not do, what maybe no remake could ever do, was keep the wandering and keep the joy and keep the exact alchemy of a show that let children be children in the middle of a war and trusted its audience to feel the horror it did not show. Those things were not features you could port over. They were the temperament of a specific show made by specific people at a specific moment, and when those people left and the form changed and the tone dropped, that temperament could not survive the crossing. The remake kept the story. It could not keep the soul, because the soul was never in the story. It was in the telling. And the telling is the one thing an adaptation, by its nature, has to do for itself. There is one more difference underneath all the others, and it is the obvious one. So obvious that it is easy to forget. It explains a great deal. One of these shows is a cartoon and the other is not. The change of medium from animation to live action is not a neutral container. It shapes what each show can do at the level of the frame, and a lot of the choices we have spent the night discussing are, at bottom, consequences of that shift. Animation is elastic. It can stretch and squash and exaggerate. It can hold a face in an impossible expression for comic effect. It can make a character's whole body react in ways no human body could. This is why the cartoon's comedy lands the way it does. When Sokka is baffled, or Aang is delighted, or Iroh is savoring his tea, the animation can push those feelings past the limits of a real face, can make joy or dread or absurdity vivid and immediate in a way that reads instantly and reads funny. The cartoon's lightness, the whole comic register I praised earlier, is partly a gift of the medium. Animation wants to be a little unreal, and that slight unreality is hospitable to silliness, to the cackling king and the melodramatic villain and the lemur stealing fruit. Because in a drawn world, nobody expects strict realism, and so exaggeration feels natural rather than strange. Live action is the opposite. A real human face, a real physical set, a real actor in real costume, all of it pulls toward the literal, and the literal is a harsher landscape for certain kinds of magic. This is exactly what the showrunner meant when he said the goofy version of Boomy did not work in live action. A cackling, riddling madman is a joy as a drawing, where the exaggeration reads as delightful, but put a real actor's real face on that same performance. And it can tip into something uncomfortable, something that reads as merely bizarre rather than charming. The medium is less forgiving of the broad and the silly. It wants a certain grounding, a certain realism, or it curdles. So when the remake darkened Boomy, thinned the comedy, lowered the tone, it was not only making an artistic choice, it was partly obeying the demands of a medium that punishes the very exaggeration animation rewards. Some of the joy the cartoon had was joy that live action structurally struggles to keep. But the trade runs both ways, and I want to be fair to what live action gives because it is not only a subtraction. A real face can do things a drawing cannot, can hold a small, ambiguous, flickering emotion, can let grief and pride and fear cross a person in the same quiet moment without a single word. This is why the performances that the remake was most praised for were the ones built on interiority rather than spectacle. The work on Zuko, the buried hurt under the anger, and the work on Iroh, the warmth over the sorrow, drew the strongest reactions precisely because live action is superb at exactly that, the human face carrying a feeling it will not speak. Animation can show you a lot, but there is a particular kind of subtle, held, wordless emotion that a good actor's real face delivers better than any drawing. And where the remake leaned into that, into quiet performance rather than broad spectacle, it found things the cartoon could only gesture at. The medium that struggles with silliness excels at the small, true ache. The bending itself lives in this same tension. In the cartoon, bending is choreography and imagination, drawn with a fluidity and a scale that answers to no physics but the animators. Water arcing in perfect, impossible ribbons, fire blooming exactly as the frame requires, earth and air moving with a grace that exists only because someone drew it that way. In live action, bending becomes visual effects layered onto real bodies in real space. And by most accounts, the remake's effects were actually impressive, one of the things nearly every review praised. But impressive is a different thing than free. The effects are grounded in a physical world, weightier, more literal, more constrained by the need to look real. And while that grounding gives the bending a certain heft, a sense of real force in real space, it also loses the pure, dreamlike elasticity of the drawn version, where a waterbender's movement could be as beautiful and as unreal as a brushstroke. The cartoon's bending was a painting in motion. The remake's bending is a special effect, and a good one, and those are not the same kind of beautiful. So a great deal of what we have called creative choice tonight is partly medium destiny. The darker tone, the thinner comedy, the grounded boomy, the weightier bending, the more literal spirit world, all of these lean in the direction live action naturally pulls, toward the real, the grounded, the serious, and away from the elastic, the exaggerated, the dreamlike. And the things the remake did best, the interior performances, the small human aches on real faces, are the things live action naturally does better than animation. When you watch the two shows side by side and feel that fundamental difference in the body before you can name a single plot change, a lot of what you are feeling is simply the difference between drawing and photography, between a medium that wants to be a little unreal and a medium that wants to be real. The cartoon was made of a substance friendly to wonder and play. The remake is made of a substance friendly to weight and truth. Neither substance is better. But they are different clay, and you cannot mold the same shape from both. And much of the gap between these two versions of Avatar is the gap between the two materials they are made of. Before we close, let me stay for a moment with a question that hovers over this whole exercise, which is why any of this should bother us at all, because there is a version of the fan reaction to a remake that is pure grievance, a cataloging of changes as a list of crimes, and I have tried all night not to do that, and I want to say plainly why. The cartoon is not in danger. The remake changing the story does not reach back through time and alter the original. Every frame of the animated series still exists, unspoiled, exactly as it was, and it will go on existing and go on being loved long after the arguments about the adaptation have gone quiet. Nothing the Netflix show did can touch it. When people talk as though a remake ruins the thing it adapts, they are describing a fear, not a fact. The original is safe. It was always safe. So the differences are not injuries. They are more like a translation, and translation is the right frame, I think, for understanding what the remake even is. When you translate a great poem into another language, you cannot keep everything. The rhymes will not survive the crossing, or the puns, or the particular music of the original words. A good translator has to decide, over and over, what to preserve and what to sacrifice, has to choose whether to be faithful to the literal meaning or the spirit or the sound, and every choice is a loss and a gain at once. The remake is a translation of Avatar out of the language of episodic animation and into the language of serialized live action, and like every translation, it kept some things and lost others and invented a few new ones to compensate, And arguing about whether it should have kept this or that is really arguing about how you would have translated it, which is a fine and pleasurable argument to have as long as you remember that the original poem is still sitting right there, untranslated and perfect whenever you want it. And there is a real value, I have come to think, in seeing a beloved story translated even imperfectly, because the translation shows you the original in a new light. Watching the remake softens Aang's flight into an accident made me understand, more clearly than I ever had, how much the cartoon's version of that flight was doing, how load-bearing his guilt really was. Watching the remake pull Azula forward made me appreciate exactly how much the cartoon's delayed reveal was worth. Watching the remake darken, Bumi made me see, for the first time really, that Bumi's silliness was a whole philosophy and not just comic relief. A translation, even a flawed one, is a kind of X-ray. It shows you the bones of the thing you loved by rearranging them, lets you see the structure precisely because the structure has been altered. I understand the cartoon better for having watched someone else try to carry it across the gap and drop a few things on the way. The drops taught me what was heaviest. It is also worth remembering that the story is not finished. The remake was built to run 3 seasons, with the third meant to conclude the whole adaptation, to carry it through the events of the cartoon's final book and the coming of the Comet, the first season set on the shelf, and finally Armed. So every judgment we make now is a judgment on an unfinished thing, and some of the choices that trouble me may yet pay off. Some of the seeds planted early, the earned blue flames, Aang's terror of his own power, the doubt Zhao spat about Ozai's rejection, the goofy Roku's suspect advice about attachment, may be building toward payoffs the finished show will justify, or they may not. We do not know yet, and there is something appropriate about ending a comparison of 2 versions of Avatar in a state of not knowing, suspended, waiting to see how it turns out, which is exactly where the remake left its heroes, fleeing a fallen city with their avatar unconscious in the dark, not yet knowing whether the light comes back. We are watching from the same uncertainty they are. The story is still being told, and the final verdict on the changes and on the whole endeavor is not ours to give yet. What I can say from where we stand is that the 2 shows can coexist, and that this is the healthiest way to hold them. You do not have to choose. You can love the cartoon as the definitive thing, the masterpiece, the one that got the alchemy exactly right, and still find real pleasure and real intelligence in the remake, in its handsome faces and its heavier stakes and its handful of genuinely inspired reinventions. They are not rivals for a single throne. They are 2 tellings of one story, one of them touched by something close to genius, and the other a sincere, uneven, respectful attempt to carry that story to people who might never have watched a cartoon. And both of those things are allowed to exist, and the world is slightly richer for having both in it than it would be with only one. The cartoon does not need me to defend it, and the remake does not deserve to be dismissed. Somewhere between those 2 facts is the honest place to stand. So let me widen out one last time, past the 2 shows and the ledger of their differences, to the thing they are both, in the end, versions of, because it is worth remembering why we are comparing them so carefully in the first place. We do not spend this kind of attention on stories that do not matter. Nobody makes a 3-hour comparison of 2 adaptations of something forgettable. The reason the differences between the cartoon and the Netflix show provoke such feeling, the reason people argue about a softened Sokka or a darkened Bumi with the heat usually reserved for real losses, is that the original meant something and goes on meaning something far beyond its modest origins as an animated program on a children's network. Avatar. The Last Airbender was never supposed to be what it became. It was a cartoon aimed at kids, airing between other cartoons, and by every reasonable expectation, it should have been enjoyed and outgrown and half-remembered, the way most things made for children are. Instead, it grew into one of the best-loved and most respected pieces of storytelling of its era, a show that adults return to and study and quote and pass to their own children, a show whose emotional intelligence and moral seriousness and sheer craft are argued to sit alongside the best television ever made in any form for any age. It did that not by being grim or by pretending to be more grown up than it was, but by taking children seriously, by trusting a young audience with genocide and grief and moral complexity and the slow, hard work of becoming a good person, all wrapped inside a story that was also sincerely fun. That is the achievement. That is why it endures. It believed that a story for children could be about the largest things there are, and it was right. And that is finally why the remake exists at all, and why its every difference is measured so jealously against the original. You do not get a big-budget live-action adaptation on the world's largest streaming service unless the thing you are adapting has passed into something like myth, unless a whole generation carries it in their chest as a formative love. The remake stands as a monument to the cartoon's importance even where it falls short of the cartoon's quality. Its existence is proof that the little animated program became a giant, that its world of benders and spirits and a boy out of time earned a place in the culture large enough to be worth all this money and all this care and all this argument. The remake is, in a sense, the cartoon's triumph wearing a different face, evidence that the story got big enough to be worth retelling and worth fighting about, and worth falling asleep to on a quiet night while someone talks you gently through every choice each version made. Whatever the third season brings, whatever the finished remake turns out to be, the animated series will keep doing the thing it has done for 20 years now, sitting faintly on a shelf or a server, waiting to level a new viewer with an empty air temple and a princess who becomes the moon, and an old man singing to his dead son. It does not need the remake and it does not fear it. It simply goes on being what it always was, one of the kindest and wisest and most beautiful stories anyone ever disguised as a cartoon for kids. And the fact that we spent all this time tonight measuring another version against it is the highest compliment either show could receive because you only measure things against a masterpiece, and we both know which one that is. So rest now. Let the two shows blur together in your mind the way they were always going to. The drawn one and the filmed one, the wandering one and the driving one, the joyful one and the heavy one. Two tellings of a boy who was frozen in the ice and woke to a broken world and chose, against everything, to save it gently. It is a good story to fall asleep inside. It always has been. And whichever version carried you here, the one you grew up with or the one you found last week, the heart of the thing is the same, a child learning that the world is worth protecting precisely because it still holds room for kindness and for play. And for people who refuse to give up on each other no matter how dark it gets. Thank you for spending this long night here with me, drifting through all of it. The changes and the losses and the handful of small, quiet triumphs. I hope you're warm, and I hope you're nearly asleep, and I hope that whatever version of Avatar you love it a little better for having looked so closely at the other one. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.